Testing 1, 2. Excellent. Right, so we're live again. So welcome back. We're going to do a short test with Alan very soon, but before he comes on, today I'm feeling less tired, which is good for me and bad for you, because it means that I'm a bit more zippy, and that means I'm going to give you more work to do. So I'm going to start off with an idea. It sort of follows on from yesterday, and my concern that I don't just want this to be a lovely roundtable discussion, which, as fun as it is, won't actually get anything done, along with Owen's sort of commentary from yesterday of what is the best thing to do in a certain circumstance you're trying to do good. And of course, it's never very clear what the best thing to do is. And I've always found, doing this project the last 2 years, that the best thing is not obvious. But I know what the worst thing is, or worst things. And one such idea, which Pierce and I have been having, is to translate this into some sort of academic unit of currency. Because once you get a unit of currency, people can sort of trade it, and they like to have it in their hands. And one of the main units of currency for academics is publications. In fact, Alan, who's going to be coming up shortly, asked me when we first started talking about this, so if I'm working on this, what sort of publications can I, if I work on this, what can I publish and where? My first response was, that's kind of not the point. But I realized that, when in Rome, you got to do as the Romans do. In academia, you got to do as the academics do. So, Pierce and I propose that we form a journal. Yes? Yeah. So we pretty much have formed a newsletter, and that's going to contain sort of observations and commentary of issues in ethics and mathematics that we see. And everyone is more than welcome to join that, and we'll try and send that out, what is it, once every week or two, something like that? Yes, something like that, depending on how things go. But that's just sort of a starting point. What we really want is to have a journal. Journal of Ethics and Mathematics. The journal that is written for a mathematical audience. It doesn't necessarily need to have mathematical contributions. Maybe contributions from lawyers, from psychologists, from people in education. But the audience is not lawyers, psychologists, and people in education. The audience is a room full of mathematicians, because we are the ones having to implement this. Of course, once you have a journal, there's work to be done. You need editors. People who have some understanding of the area, maybe can referee articles themselves, maybe know other people who can referee these articles. Now, if only I had a room full of mathematicians with an intrinsic understanding of the fact that there's ethics in math. Oh, wait. Hi. Guess what? You just got volunteered. And as soon as Ross Anderson turns up, he's getting volunteered too. Nice. Voluntold. I like it. So we end up with a journal. Once you have a journal, academics see this as a thing worth contributing to that they can get recognition for. Their currency. Yes, Pierce. Right. So to keep effort and cost down, because we have no money, we make this electronic. Hopefully, we can do this as an archive overlay. There's a slight problem with that. You'll be in an archive. You'll select the little drop down thing on what your paper's about. Anyone seen ethics in math as a drop down option? So, first order of business. Who wants to email Cornell? Because we need a new drop down menu. Done. Yeah, basically we need a drop. So there's a drop down option of history of mathematics. I don't know if there's a drop down option for philosophy of mathematics, but I think we need a dedicated tag or sub tag. I don't know how they want to do it. They've probably got their own rules on how they do this, but we need a tag or sub tag that says ethics in mathematics, because that's what mathematicians see. And in fact, I want to see someone go to submit their paper on archive in topology or whatever, click on the drop down link and go, what the hell? Because that makes it real. I don't remember. Aardvark ethics in mathematics. Right. Yeah. So I think there's big tags and then small tags. So the big tags are math group theory, math topology, math history, math analysis. Oh, here we go. So yeah, there's, I don't know. There's a page somewhere that, oh, here they are. You can sort of look at them. Scroll down a bit. Yeah, down a bit more. Okay, there we go. That's them. There should be history there. Where is it? But that's what. Yeah, I think given the relative cost of adding a tag, which is probably 1/10 of a cent or something like that, and given the impact that having a tag on there would actually have, I think we should try to contact them. I think Jane should do that, and if they say no, then we all contact them ourselves and say, why did you say no? Why did you say no? And they'll eventually, be frustrated into some sort of acknowledgement. Jane, we're still live here, so.
It'd obviously be easier if there are people who've actually got articles they want to deposit on archive under the title Ethics and Maths fairly quickly.
So while I think it's a good idea to contact them, I think it's likely that they'll be very resistant to adding a new category. But I think if they say it's fine for you to put this in history and overview, then that solves one problem.
Right. Yeah. Although we'd want to sort of make it clear that this may eventually need its own tag. So they can either put it under history and overview and then try and migrate stuff or cause confusion, or just bite the bullet, give us a tag and call it a day. And hopefully if they're reasonable enough, we can say, well, this tag is so important that, your little bit of work here will actually help this along quite a lot. Yes?
I'll put all of this on the first version of the newsletter. So maybe all of you could be writing, asking for this.
They won't know what hit them. So that sort of follows on from my real aim of this workshop, which is do stuff. And this is a thing. Adding a tag to archive, that's a thing. When one of my students wrote a petition and emailed it to all his friends, and they emailed it to their friends, saying that the faculty here should put ethics in math as a listed non-examinable course, that's a thing. When you can print something out and put it on the table, you've made a thing. That's what we need to keep in mind, I think, for the rest of the day, which in part discuss relevant ideas and ways forward, and what's a better sort of approach, worse approach. What's the best? Okay, maybe we sort of don't always agree on what the best is, but ultimately, we're going to make things. Otherwise, it's just echoes in a room, which is fun, but doesn't get anywhere. Archive tag, that's a thing. Overlay journal, that's a thing. Newsletter, that's a thing. Right, do you want to say that?
So I don't know how many people know about this, just Piers. But we've just got, the Ethics and Mathematics Society has just got funding to do a week-long convention in October here for students. It's, yeah, a kind of immersive convention. It'll be during term time, so they'll have morning classes, but in the afternoons and potentially evenings, there'll be sort of workshops and stands and stuff like that. Ethics and mathematics themed, but a lot of kind of empowerment of students and, you know, the career stuff that like gets them interested to come in the first place. One part of that is this ambassador program, which occurs simultaneously, which is basically going to be 12 students from different universities, ideally 2 per university, so 6 universities. And they would come in a kind of intensive way, and they would learn in a much more, in a focused group. They wouldn't have morning classes. They'd have to take time out of school. So it would have to be students for which that would not be harmful, which we would need to check with their professors. So we would place the judgment call on both them and their professors for that. We believe it exists. It's possible that there exists 12 students in the UK for whom that's true, and that they're the best ones to tell us that. And so we think it's a good idea to like tell everyone now, in case you are at a university or no university where such a student exists. It won't be for most students. This won't be good for them, but their profs and themselves want to know, and they'll be sort of interviewed as well. So there will be quite a process.
This is probably undergrad, mainly because you want longevity at the return institution. So hopefully people are going to be around for a bit longer there. This is kind of a Noah's Ark type activity. You know, bring in everything 2 by 2 by 2. The reason we go for 2 is because when 2 people go back home, they can talk to each other. That's the important part. That's what we had here in Cambridge. Pierce and I could have conversations. There were 2 of us. Something Sam had asked before was how to make this have greater impact. Well, we've only sort of opened this up for the UK, but there's no physical reason why this can't extend to lands further away. Of course, there's financial limits. If we can convince our funding body that this would have even more impact by, you know, importing some people from over the pond, so to speak, then there's in principle no reason why we can't have people from the States or anywhere else like that. It's just whether we can get money for it. Yeah. But as it so happens, we have only academics from the States in the room at the moment, or Europe. Well, Europe for the next 11 and a half months before the UK sort of saws itself off the rest of the European Union. Okay, so I think Alan is ready or ready-ish. But we've now had, oh no.
Hello?
Hello, Alan. Give us a second. We're having slight problems here with our display screen.
Okay.
Hang on. We have a question about the journal.
I suggest that you think very carefully about your target audience. If your target audience is people like those who are in this room, that's one thing. If your target audience is mathematicians, broad, and how to attract people.
So we have to think about that kind of carefully, and whether we do want the focus to be people sort of like people in this room, to help empower them to have more academic material behind them, or whether we want a completely general. It's unclear to me which is best, and that'll take a little bit of thought. So we'd have to sort of ponder that for a little while longer to see what the right audience is. But my initial response would be probably to people like people in this room who sort of already have I mean, who goes and reads a group theory journal if they're not a group theorist? But group theorists go and tell non-group theorists about group theory because they love it. It's great. It's fantastic. It looks pretty and all that. So maybe the same would sort of apply. This is a journal for people who kind of already think that ethics in math is something that needs to be discussed, and then can use what they pick up from that journal to go and talk to everyone else in their faculty. But we have to think about this a bit more carefully. Alan, are you there? You're slightly muted. Can you hear us, Alan? We can't hear you. Give us a second.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can now hear you. Hang on, your microphone is a bit soft.
Is it okay like that? I can speak closer to the mic.
Okay, I'm right up there. Tam, what can we do to try and fix that? Okay, we're gonna have to be really. So, Alan, you can get going now, but we're gonna have to be really quiet so we can hear you clearly.
Okay, so I will try to speak close to the microphone. Okay, like that?
We can't really hear at the moment.
Okay.
That's
Is it better?
that's
Okay.
that's slightly better.
Yeah. Okay, I will use my voice as my voice as a professor.
Hang on a second. We're still having a little bit of trouble. Can you turn your speakers off for a moment and say a few words, and then turn them back on, and we'll see whether that improves the situation.
Okay. My speakers are off. Is it better? Is it better?
That didn't help. That didn't help. Sorry. Hang
on. Do you have any headphones, or what's your microphone setup like?
I can try to get you some headphones.
Because there might be a built-in mic in the headphones, which might have good noise cancellation.
No, this I don't have.
Pardon?
I don't have any mic. I mean, except the built-in mic on my computer.
Most headphones have mics in them.
Yeah, no, but I don't have any.
Oh, earphones. Oh. Okay, we'll try and turn off the... Yeah, I don't think the bandwidth is... Then it's not live streamed, but yeah. Yeah. Or we can leave this here and turn...
We're gonna try and do a direct Hangouts call to you to see if that improves things. So just stay on there. Open Gmail while you're logged in. answer that if you can. Can you see what that's ringing, Alan?
Yeah, I can hear something.
Were you able to answer that?
Where should I click? Can you hear me?
Alan, can you go to the settings of your laptop and turn the, or hang on a second. Can you turn the sensitivity of your microphone up? Is that possible? In like whatever it is, Windows, Apple sound control. We muted him. Can we unmute him? Okay, now you're completely muted. So whatever you did, that was not good. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Better? Even better?
Whoa.
That's too much?
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of sort of hum and fuzz there.
Well,
Try introducing yourself just briefly. Let's have a listen to how that sounds now. Say your name and university.
is it better?
It's just try saying your name and university.
My name is Alain Valette. I'm from the University of Neuchâtel.
Oh no, it's still not very good. Do you know where the mic actually is located on your machine? The physical location of the mic.
Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Where is it on the is it in the
It's on top of
so, no, we can't really hear that. Try speaking down towards the keyboard and say your name again.
So my name is Alain Valette.
Okay, that so do that, like go real close to it, do that. You kind of look funny, but you sound better. So that we can deal with that.
Okay, so is it better now? Well, I will speak closer to the microphone, I suppose.
No, that wasn't very good. Go.
It wasn't still not good.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Alan, can you give us a telephone number and we can try and call you through, give you a telephone call through this? That might actually be better for us.
Telephone number. Yes. Do you get it on chat?
Yeah, we've got that. Oh. So delete the 0041 then. Oh. Hang on. Try it again. Okay, it says we have credits. Did it? Okay. Hang on a second.
Mm-hmm.
No. That's gonna take too long. But it probably. Alan, try answering this Hangouts call again. It's gonna come through. Yeah. So leave this Hangouts call,
Okay.
and then we're gonna call you straight on Gmail. You canceled the wrong one.
Yeah. Is it better now? Still the wrong one?
Not there. Go to make the call on through Gmail. Okay, is that on? Good. Right, so we're going to move on and then try and get Alan back a bit later. So we have Varun Warrior, and he's going to talk to us about autism and mathematical ability. Is there a biological link? Warren's just finished his PhD here in Cambridge. Do you need slides for this? Is that right? You emailed them to me, didn't you? Okay, give me 2 seconds. Oh, hold this. That's actually slightly better. Keep close to the thing. Let's try this for a minute and see what happens. Okay, so everyone, this is Alain Valette from Neuchâtel, and he's going to try and talk to us about angels or demons. So let's see if we can get the audio running smoothly here. Go, Alain. Alan, sorry for a second. We can hear you, but if you could speak a little bit slower, and a little bit louder, and with your face just a little bit closer to the screen. So speak like you're speaking to an 8-year-old. Maybe that's sort of a slightly deaf 8-year-old. That might help things because we can sometimes hear you quite clearly, and sometimes it sort of muffles a bit. So a bit slower and clearer and louder. Move your hands away. That's kind of not helping. Move your hands away from your head. Uh, but yeah. So yeah. So mainly speak slower and louder. Alan, so it's becoming slightly difficult to hear. Can you hear me? It's becoming slightly difficult to hear you.
Right. My name is Warren Warrior, and I'm not a mathematician. I work on the genetics of autism, which is over there. And I'm also not autistic. So whatever I tell you today is what I've heard from other autistic people and my experience working with some autistic people. So obviously, if you meet an autistic person, they might tell you something differently. So do bear that in mind. Um, um, I am a geneticist and I work at the Autism Research Center, where I have been for the past few years studying the link between autism and mathematical ability. So I'm going to start with a basic introduction to autism. I'm not sure how many of you know what autism is, but autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. So you can find the earliest signs of autism in children as young as 6 months of age. And there are sort of three aspects to autism. Usually, autistic individuals have significant difficulties in social interaction, so that's social impairment over there. Alongside that, they also have excessive repetitive behaviors and fairly sort of narrow focused interests. We all have sort of narrow and focused interests, but autistic individuals have them more extreme than most other people. And some autistic individuals, not all of them, also have difficulties in speech and communication, and usually sort of language delays and deficits. I'm also not sure how clear this slide is, but right. In addition to these sort of three core symptoms, um, autistic individuals also have a whole host of other difficulties. So, for example, if you sort of see there this cartoon of the small boy holding his ears, that's probably because he is oversensitive and hypersensitive. Oh yeah, perfect. This one, hypersensitive to sensory stimulus, and he's sort of trying to block it out. And if you see this one, you can see that this child is wearing a T-shirt that's orange and white stripe, and he has two other T-shirts of the same pattern. And someone's offering him a T-shirt that's clearly not of the same pattern, and he's finding it difficult because he likes things to be structured in a certain way. And when you offer them, on average, autistic individuals something slightly different, they find it difficult to cope with change. So as I mentioned earlier, there are these sort of two core symptoms that's there in autism. One is the impaired social communication and interaction, and the other one is restrictive and repetitive behaviors. But alongside that, I think what we also need to understand is that autism is not a single entity. It also comes with other comorbidities. So many autistic individuals have language impairment. Approximately 30% of autistic individuals have intellectual disabilities. Many of them also have anxiety. There are also other medical comorbidities like sleep, severe constipation or sleep difficulties. Epilepsy is also very common. So it really is a constellation of conditions that autistic individuals have. Um, what are the statistics of autism in the UK? As many as 1% of the population is thought to have autism. Not all of them end up with a diagnosis. And when you put that in actual numbers, that's 140,000 school-age children and approximately 2.8 million lives that are touched by autism every day. Bullying is very, very common in autistic children. You can sort of imagine, when you're in your teens or perhaps early childhood, you're forced to fit certain stereotypes. And if you don't fit those social stereotypes, then you're often an outcast or bullied. 1 in 5 children on the autism spectrum have been excluded from more than one school. The rate of expulsions of autistic children is quite high. Among autistic adults, as many as 40% of autistic adults or 40% of homeless people are thought to be on the autism spectrum. And 72% of the children on the spectrum are reported to being judged or misunderstood. So, clearly the level of difficulties and disabilities that autistic individuals face is very, very high. Autism is also a condition that disproportionately affects men than women. So if you sort of see the slide over here, this is autism, and you can see that on average, as many as 5 times more men are diagnosed with autism than women. Now, there are multiple reasons to this. Some of it is biological, but some of it is also sort of diagnostic. So women often need autism presents differently in women women probably need a more severe level of disability for them to receive a diagnosis. There's also bias among clinicians. Clinicians think that autism is an exclusively male condition when that's not the case. And this sort of bias also extends to other conditions. So conditions like depression uh, is more likely to be diagnosed in women than in men, whereas something like ADHD is again more likely to be diagnosed in boys than in girls. There's a very interesting relationship between autism and IQ. Uh, I think I mentioned earlier that as many as 30% of individuals with autism have severe intellectual disability. But on the other hand, if you look at the spectrum of IQ in autism, there's a large chunk of autistic individuals who have mild autism or high functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome, where they have exceptionally superior intelligence. They are very good at solving problems, or they're extremely talented artists. And clearly, the sort of distribution of IQ in autism is not similar to the distribution of IQ in the general population. So you get both ends of the IQ spectrum in autism. The other thing to bear in mind is that when we sort of think of autism, we think of it as a binary condition. But we can think of sub-threshold autistic traits that we all have. We all have autistic traits to varying extents, but not all of us are autistic. So you can measure autistic traits using multiple different instruments. And over here is one such instrument that we have developed in our lab a couple of years ago, which is called the Autism Spectrum Quotient. The scores on this instrument are from 0 to 50, with 50 being very high autistic traits. And you can see over here, the dotted lines represent individuals who do not have an autism diagnosis. And you can see that the scores are by and large sort of normally distributed. And this line over here represents individuals who have an autism diagnosis. And you can see that their scores are significantly shifted towards the right. And I think this sort of points to the fact that autistic traits are on average and normally distributed in the general population. And you need a combination of high autistic traits and as well as significant social impairments for you to receive an autism diagnosis. Autism is partly genetic. We know this because autism tends to run in families. So if there's one child with an autism diagnosis, a second child is more than 3 times likely to receive an autism diagnosis. We also know this from twin studies. Identical twins are more likely to be diagnosed with autism if one of them is diagnosed with autism than non-identical twins. And over the many years, we have identified quite a lot of genes that are associated with autism. There are probably hundreds or thousands of genes that are associated with autism. We've identified only a handful of them. Many of them are also involved in other sort of conditions. For example, FMR1, this gene over here, which was identified in early 1990s, is also involved in a condition known as Fragile X mental retardation, which is a condition with intellectual disability. So what is the link between autism and mathematical talent? What's the sort of historical, epidemiological, and genetic evidence? If you go back to the very first descriptions of autism, they were made by 2 scientists, 1944, Hans Asperger, who used to work in Vienna, and Leo Kanner, who was American. They sort of alluded to these specific lines when they first described autism. Hans Asperger wrote that a lack of empathy, little ability to form friendships, one-sided conversations, and intense absorption in a special interest and clumsy movements stereotypically describe autistic individuals. Whereas Leo Kanner wrote that children's inability to relate themselves in the ordinary way to people and situations from the beginning of life and the precise recollection of complex pattern and sequences are also fairly typical of autistic individuals. And they both noted this separately. They said, in separate reports, they said that fathers of children with autism tended to be highly intelligent and in several cases worked in technical fields. So early on, from the very first descriptions, there were these ideas that perhaps autistic individuals might have a link to, sort of technical or mathematical talent. So then, since then, there has been a host of other studies which link autism to STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and maths. So you can see that there's a higher prevalence of autism in families of students who study STEM subjects compared to literature. So in students who study science, technology, engineering, math tend to have higher prevalence of autism. There's also higher prevalence of autism in school-age kids in IT-rich regions compared to control regions. And autistic individuals are more likely to enroll in STEM majors compared to the general population and compared to individuals with other learning disorders. If you look at autistic traits and measure them in STEM professionals and non-STEM professionals, you find that STEM professionals have higher autistic traits on average than non-STEM professionals. And in a study from Sweden that's not been published yet, fathers of children with fathers of children with autism tend to have higher technical IQ compared to fathers of children without autism. And finally, students studying maths go higher on measure of autistic traits. So all these sort of different lines of evidence pointing towards a link between sort of aptitude in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics and autism/autism. So this leads us to this particular theory that was developed in our lab, which is the empathizing and systemizing theory of autism. So over here, I must first say that empathizing does not conflate with kindness. Kindness is very, very different. We define empathy as the ability to identify what someone else is thinking or feeling and respond appropriately to it. And if you sort of think of these two different domains, one being empathizing and the other being systemizing, where systemizing is is an interest or an aptitude in systems. So, like the aptitude to find patterns in, day-to-day information. You can try and classify people along these two different axes, one domain being empathizing and the other being systemizing. And so on this graph over here, it's a fairly busy graph. If you have your scores on a measure of empathy, which is the empathy quotient, and at the bottom you have an axis which measures systemizing, it increases along the x-axis and that increases along the y-axis. And if you just plot individuals with autism, men and women, you find that they tend to, on average, cluster in very sort of different domains. So autistic individuals, which are sort of represented by these green squares, tend to be towards the extreme systemizing domain, where the systemizing scores are, on average, much higher than the empathy scores. If you look at men, they also tend to be shifted a bit more towards the systemizing end of the spectrum compared to the empathy end of the spectrum. Women, on the other hand, the scores are more towards the empathy end of the spectrum than the systemizing end of the spectrum. These are only averages. This is not true of every single autistic individual or every single male or every single female. You can also look at large data sets. So we had access to data from 633,000 individuals, and of which 33,000 of them had an autism diagnosis. And you look at the scores on the empathy quotient and on the systemizing quotient. So you can see that compared to individuals without an autism diagnosis, autistic individuals have a significant shift towards lower empathy scores, and autistic individuals, on the other hand, have a significant shift towards higher systemizing scores, sort of validating what we had observed in smaller data. And then I'm not sure how well this isn't particularly clear, but I guess that's clearer. So then if we sort of classify people based on the occupations and divide people into STEM occupations versus non-STEM occupations, you can see that if you just look at the mean and standard deviations of the scores on these scales, you can see that people who work STEM professionals tend to have slightly lower and significant scores on the empathy quotient, slightly higher scores on the systemizing quotient, and slightly higher scores on the autism spectrum quotient, which is an estimate of autistic traits. So again, from large data sets, we are sort of coming to similar figures. And because I'm a geneticist, I was also interested in the genetics of all of this. This sort of overlap that we are observing from an epidemiological perspective, is this because of shared genetics? So genetics is involved in any human attribute. Any human attribute is partly heritable or partly due to genetics. And we can look at what fraction of aptitude in science, technology, and engineering and mathematics is genetic, and what fraction of those genes also contribute to risk for autism. So this is the genetic correlation. So if you have positive genetic correlation, that means there's the same set of genes that contribute to aptitude in STEM occupations also increase your risk for certain conditions. And if it's negative, it's the other way around. It sort of decreases the risk for certain conditions. Um, so what you can see is that for autism, there's a small but significant positive genetic correlation between the genes that contribute to autism and the genes that also increase your aptitude in science, technology, engineering, and maths. But the sort of bulk of the evidence comes from different measures of IQ and educational attainment, which shows that by and large, the same set of genes that contribute to aptitude in STEM subjects also contributes to higher IQ and educational attainment. So, what are the implications of all of this? I think we need to sort of bear in mind that autistic traits are on a continuum. We all have different levels of autistic traits. And there are multiple lines of evidence that suggest that mathematicians, STEM professionals have, on average, higher autistic traits. And the question is, how can you help? Because, you're all people who interact with mathematicians. And there are a few sort of ways that you can help. Of course, this sort of differs from person to person, and if you meet an autistic person, it may not be true of them. Um, but on average, they really like structure. So autistic individuals are resistant to change, and if you provide structure, that really helps them. So if you structure your lectures, that'll be very useful, telling them what exactly you're going to talk about and why you're going to talk about that, often in advance, can be very useful. If you also try and organize your lectures and your talks at the same venue and at the same time, that's also very useful. Visual cues. Autistic people, on average, use usually sort of visual thinkers. They like visual cues, and they're also not very fond of long strings of verbal information. They tend to get lost. Um, stand up against stand up against bullying. Many autistic individuals have been bullied. It's unlikely that at university they're bullied, but they might also be bullied at universities. So be aware of that and ask them if they're being bullied, or if you see they're getting bullied, stand up to that. Be aware of comorbidities. University is tough, especially if you come for undergrad, it's quite tough. So if you think from a perspective of an autistic individual, they probably lived at home, which is a secure environment for them, and they're coming to university, which is a very new environment for them with many new things that they're not aware of. So most undergrads would go through a period of anxiety or depression and things like that while they try and settle in. This is probably even worse in autistic individuals. To be aware of it and point them to resources. Be aware of stimming behavior. So stimming behavior, things like humming or flapping your hands, and usually this is a way to sort of control anxiety. It's a way to sort of control the amount of cognitive information you're getting. So don't be alarmed by it, and don't discourage people from having stimming behavior. There are also different methods of learning. Autistic individuals may use fairly non-typical methods of learning, which you may not be aware of. Many autistic individuals also have something called synesthesia, where they can associate numbers and words with certain colors, textures, or tastes. This is how this is how they can process information. So encourage these strategies. Don't discourage them. Also, don't be alarmed by atypical social behavior. Autistic individuals may come across as being extremely forthright, and some people may think of it as being rude. But this is just who they are. They are not necessarily being rude, and they don't intend to cause harm. Um, and also try to be as straightforward as possible. So avoid idioms. Don't provide too many choices. This can overwhelm autistic individuals. And all of this points to one bottom line, which is try and limit overstimulation. Um, with sort of sensory and non-sensory stimulation, autistic people can get overwhelmed. So try and limit that as much as possible. If you like, you can measure your own autistic traits online. You can take the autism spectrum quotient. I'm happy to share these slides, so you can click on the link. There's a maximum score of 50. Scores of above 30 to indicate a high number of autistic traits. It's not an indicator that you are autistic, because autism is a combination of high autistic traits, environment where you're not able to flourish, and difficulties in social interactions. But if you suspect that you have a high autistic traits and you have autism, check with your GP if you want to receive a diagnosis, and you can get in touch with the National Autistic Services for more. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but it's essentially about the environment that you're in. So there are, for example, over here, in fact, what you said is absolutely right. If you have Asperger's syndrome, uh, then you might not get bullied, but if you're elsewhere, you might get bullied. It's about who you are with and what is sort of typical in that particular environment.
Everything that you're saying, you seem to me to conflate autism and Asperger's, and what you're saying about Asperger's doesn't fit with autism. I have read that this is a controversial link. Can you explain why you think they are the same, since they seem to be so different, and why do people think they are not the same?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think it just boils down to uh, diagnosis. So there are sort of two diagnostic criteria that people use. One is called DSM-5, which is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Um, so in DSM-5, with the latest version of DSM-5, they have removed the term Asperger syndrome. So it's just autism. The difference between, from a diagnostic point of view, the difference between Asperger syndrome and autism is that uh, with autism, you have language difficulties and you usually have developmental delay, which is not the case with Asperger syndrome at all. Um, but then it's not easy to sort of identify this. And quite often, someone might get a diagnosis of autism, and in fact, they might have Asperger syndrome. Um, so the Americans and the latest version of that particular manual has got only the term autism, and they don't recognize the term Asperger syndrome anymore. And hence why I use the term autism throughout. Um, but that said, there's also something called ICD-10, which is the international classification, which still retains the term Asperger syndrome. But many people don't necessarily recognize the term Asperger syndrome. Yeah, I mean, it's these are terms essentially. So it's just up to each individual to feel that they recognize with Asperger versus autism. Um, it's still a valid term. Asperger is still a valid term. It's still being used in ICD-10. I'm not sure if it will be still be used in the next version of ICD. I can't talk about that. Um, but there are some differences between autism and Asperger, but by and large, we think of it as, I think, in our lab at least, we sort of think of it as along one entire spectrum, which Asperger syndrome being at one end of the spectrum and autism being at the other end.
Let's stay for another minute for a couple more questions. I first wanted to, I guess, look at this point that you raised on the difference between caring and empathy. And this is something that I've tried to pick at a little bit, which is from my experience. I see that most of the mathematicians I speak to are very caring, and if you tell them that that what they're doing is hurting someone or causing harm, their immediate response is, no, I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to cause harm. I have no intention of doing that. So in a sense, their heart is in the right place. But then you see some of the stuff that they do, or some of the things that they're later involved in, and you can see that they treat something from a technical point of view. They don't think of the final social impact. And from what I can see, this is perhaps a lack of developed empathy, because you've got to really sort of see how something rolls along and then hits someone eventually, and try and put yourself in that person's shoes. How would I feel if I was there? How would I feel if I was there? And that's a skill that well, firstly, we don't teach in the math faculty. It's not something that's particularly encouraged in order to go forward and get good grades in math. It's not. It's sort of, perpendicular to doing mathematics. And from what you're saying, it's something that matches up with those with autistic traits. So they're very happy to care about people, don't want to be causing any harm, but they don't have the right level of empathy, either through training or intrinsic quality or some combination of the two, to actually look forward and see, I'm causing problems. And this is going back to a point that we raised yesterday, which is mathematics is just like every other profession. Yeah, does technical stuff, complicated stuff, and it has its own ethical questions like everyone else does. But I think we're coming to the conclusion that the difference is that mathematicians might be slightly different to every other profession. So I'm sort of going down the road now of thinking that maybe we shouldn't be calling this ethics in mathematics. Maybe we should be calling this ethics in mathematicians, because that might address where some of the complexities lie. We sort of discussed yesterday that mathematics is just like every other profession. Oh yeah, that. Can you screen share that on the feed, please, Tam? For that. Great. Yeah. Okay. So all three viewers from around the world are having a bit of a laugh. How many have we got? Awesome. One of which is the back of this room. So yeah, this is something that I think we need to think about it more carefully. That maybe it's not the mathematics that's different. Maybe what's different is the mathematicians. And that's the reason why I initially invited one of Aaron's colleagues, but he couldn't make it, so Aaron's come in his place. And thank you so much for coming and sharing all this with us. And why I invited Glennis into our midst as well, because they have experience talking to people on the autism spectrum. Now, I don't want us to get too deeply involved in what the difference, the medical diagnostic difference between autism and Asperger's. That already is a fight that the doctors are having amongst themselves, and we have enough spats to get into that. We don't need another one. But the fact that there is understanding there that we can perhaps go and draw upon, pick up, and infer things from, because ultimately we are the ones who have to talk to the mathematicians. We can't put a room full of psychologists or clinical physicians in front of a room full of math students and say, oh, by the way, it doesn't really stick. Pierce.
I know this isn't necessarily your field, so this may be an unfair question to ask you, but of the properties that, well, I'm going to be old-fashioned and stick to Asperger's, not autism, because every time I have heard about this, I've thought the people I know and live around who have what is called Asperger's are not like the people who I have heard about who have autism. To me, I can't see why you call them the same, particularly because of the IQ difference. Is that I see these extraordinarily talented Asperger's kids or colleagues or friends. Not that I'm looking at anybody in particular. But one of the things I notice in, for example, grad students that I've had who have very clearly even been diagnosed by your people as Asperger's, is the extent to which they can be trained with things like empathy and kindness. I think Maurice's observation about kindness and empathy is extremely acute, because he's absolutely right. Mathematicians, by and large, can be made very moral and have inherent gentleness in them, and their lack of empathy means they usually don't do either. But they can be trained. And I had a grad student who I shared an office with for 3 years because he was such a catastrophe. And I shared the office with him. I mean, I let him work in my office so as to teach him life skills. And I can't say I was enormously successful, but he was better at the end of 3 years than he was at the beginning. He learned all sorts of life skills. So this is a long way of asking the question. With Asperger's rather than autism, do you have evidence of being able to train people, either deliberately or accidentally, into social behavior which counteracts or which reduces the Asperger's phenomena?
Yeah, I think, well, I probably wouldn't use the word training because it's got other implications as well. But you're right. If you sort of, for example, the example that you were giving of, sharing this office room with a grad student, that's something that I am aware of that's happened to other kids on the spectrum. And you're right. These are skills. None of these skills are non-modifiable. These are all skills that you can pick up and learn if you choose to or if you want to. But it might be a bit more difficult for someone on the spectrum to learn, or might take more time for someone on the spectrum to learn some of these skills than for someone who's not on the spectrum. But yeah, all these skills can be learned, can be picked up. The only drawback is we need to sort of recognize that sometimes when you sort of pick up these skills, or when you sort of are forced into sort of learning them, can also cause a degree of anxiety because you're unsure of whether what you're doing is right or not right. So, ultimately it's about the subjective well-being of the person. It's about what skills should they learn or should they pick up to ensure that their subjective well-being.
Okay, we're running. Oh, sorry, we'll get one more, and only because you guys sort of have the same ideas, so we should do this, and then we'll go to the video by Martin Hellman.
Hi, I'm a clinical psych. At Melbourne Uni, when I was working with and running groups, if you want, for students on the spectrum, and you're right, it is quite controversial. Asperger's autism. Asperger's is also referred to as high functioning autism. But what I found was that in working, the thing that made sense wasn't sort of training, you need to do this, was actually sitting, and I actually ended up writing a few pages or handed out, why do neurotypicals do this? What is the meaning? And it was as simple or as basic as one woman was saying, it really annoys me, my husband and daughter, I walk downstairs and they say, good morning, hi. Like, why do I need to reply? They've seen me, I'm here, I'm alive. There's no point. It's like, no, what they need to do is know that you see them, recognize them, and they want you to know that you're in their world, and they want to hear back from you that you care about them and you're in the world. And she just said, oh. Others were, why does someone ask me how I am and keep walking? Because he was really annoyed because he was late for a lecture because he had to chase a person who kept walking to say how he was. And the person he was chasing just kept looking back and kept walking faster, and he was running after them saying, I'm fine, I've had a bit of a headache, but And they're true examples. They actually happened, and I've got lots more. But what it led me to was explaining the rationale about why there are certain rituals or things that neurotypicals do. And if you understand the rationale behind it, even to the point of shaking hands, well, that's actually saying I haven't got a weapon. Oh, explaining that immediately, so you don't have to train, you give an explanation for why certain social rationale customs exist. It immediately becomes something that the person on the spectrum will then take on, unless they also hate shaking hands or touching, and they'll find another way to do it. And running through them, look, you don't have to shake hands, you can just say hi, nod, or whatever. So it's a matter of also not in terms of training, but explaining the rationale behind. And if you think about it, so much of what we do is based, and there are good reasons why we do it. But as we've developed as a society, we've made shortcuts. And the shortcuts don't seem to be linked to the actual original reason for doing it. But if you can go over it and explain it, then somebody who's neurodiverse or on the spectrum, part of the neurodiverse field, will then understand it and be able and be happier to do it. The other thing to make note is increasingly we're talking about the neurodiverse community rather than talking about dyslexia, because there's so much advantages. People with dyslexia have a huge amount to offer in terms of how they go about things. I've got ADHD and I'm on the spectrum as well. So my ADHD means I've got ideas coming everywhere. And if I can then translate those ideas and put a narrow focus from the spectrum on it, I can achieve huge amounts of work in a short amount of time. So we need to, one, look at what is the positive side of neurodiverse conditions and to talk about the autistic spectrum condition, not the autistic spectrum disorder. I really don't like the term disorder.
I so agree. It's not disorder. Around here, it's advantage. The aristocrats are the ones who are further out on the spectrum. You wanted to ideas about what we should do. Okay, here's the next suggestion. We need to form a working group with clinical psychologists, with people who understand this kind of thing, because if we're going to communicate the issues of ethics and the need for ethical behavior to mathematicians, we have to do it in a particular way, because as it were, the neurological diversity of our audience means that the same explanation that would work to politicians or historians may well not work with mathematicians. We actually need to study this quite explicitly and separately, because I mean, the moment you said, just give them a manual, that's the work with kids. They understand manuals, and that's one way that they can learn these things. You know how to do this.
I heard the exact same suggestion from Ross Anderson a couple of weeks ago. Basically said, like, just write down a list. We can learn lists. We're good at learning lists. We're damn good at learning lists. Write down a list, learn it, and that covers at least several of these. I mean, basically, society has done these shortcuts. Has these, like, these .zip ways of interacting. And the mathematicians can't unpackage those sort of social .zip files on their own.
Well, hopefully a quick question, but possibly a complicated one as well. I know that you've mentioned that in your sort of abstract, scientists, mathematicians have higher autistic traits than the general population. However, possibly a contribution to that fact is that more men typically apply for STEM subjects, and there's quite a large underrepresentation of women in certain subjects, not all, but in mathematics, but also those sort of more mathematically intensive science subjects. So in a way, is there a risk that those kind of measurements of autistic traits is almost a self-selecting sample by the fact you will inherently have more men, and more men are statistically more likely than women to be diagnosed as autism, and then it kind of goes on from there. So is there a risk of that being an issue, sort of the cultural aspects? And is that something that you're aware of anyone's looking at in any particular detail?
I guess just to follow up for your answer, what are the stats if you just do it by gender? So for men, for women.
So yes, so if you the fact that there is no representation of men in some field in the STEM subjects, but even if you sort of stratify by gender, the results still hold. But then there's also the other aspect of this: are autistic traits. When we sort of say autistic traits, are they male-specific autistic traits? Simply because autism for a long time has been thought of as a condition affecting largely men, which we know is not necessarily true, just like eating disorders is not a condition largely affecting women. Um, so this is something that I think people are working on, and we don't have a clear answer to that. And I think what is helping is that as more and more women are sort of recognizing that they may have autism, we get a better idea as a community, we get a better idea of what autistic traits are like in women. And the idea is to sort of develop a measure of traits that's not biased towards measuring traits. And then when we sort of apply these things, we probably might get slightly differences.
We're a bit short of time, but if you want to go one quick one.
I found it interesting that you were talking in terms of traits and number of traits, and I was just curious: is there almost an agreed list of traits, and is there a risk that that if some people have some of those traits and others not, and by lumping it in as autistic traits, that we'll start saying, well, if someone's got 3 of them, we'll just lump them in and assume that they've got all of them. That I'm sure there are some people who feature 1 or 2 of those and don't feature others, and they may find it harmful to them to be lumped in as, say, like that some of those other traits don't apply to them at all. And yeah, it's often combinations of traits that can actually be really empowering, and that's why I almost prefer the neurodiversity, because it's combinations of things that often make you powerful. Or
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. It's a combination of traits. It's and often these sort of traits that you're talking about are fairly distinct. I have evidence from a genetic perspective that we can at least get 2 broad categories. You can get social traits and non-social traits. Things like interest in systems, focused interest, tend to sort of correlate with things like repetitive behavior and things like that, whereas things like difficulties in social interaction don't really. But you're right, it's a combination of traits, it's multiple different spectrums that come together. But from a sort of a purely sort of biological perspective, when you're sort of developing instruments, it might be useful to sort of have one instrument that tries to sort of capture most of them.
Okay. Let's tinker with the schedule slightly. Let's go for coffee now. Let's finish coffee 5 minutes early. Come in, listen to Martin Hellman's video, and then the late morning speakers each lose a minute and a half of their talk. I think we can all shoulder that. Right, welcome back to EiM1 Saturday morning. So we now have a pre-recorded video provided to us by Professor Martin Hellman from Stanford.
Hi, I'm Martin Hellman. I'm a professor at Stanford University, and I want to thank Maurice for inviting me to join you via this video. The topic of this conference, making ethical decisions, is becoming critically important in all areas, including mathematics. Why? Because technology is giving fallible human beings power that historically has been thought of as being godlike. For example, we're creating new life forms day in and day out. Historically, that was something only God was supposed to be able to do. In mythology, only the gods could send down thunderbolts that would destroy an entire city. But today we call them nuclear weapons. And if cyber attacks become ever more virulent and our infrastructure becomes ever more vulnerable, then it's conceivable that through mathematics, through technology, we can make the world stand still. I mean, not literally, but the thing come to a halt. I'm going to use examples from a particular area where math plays a critical role. Cryptography. It's the area that I'm best known for. It's where I have the most experience in making these decisions. But the dilemmas that I face and the stories I'm going to tell you are much more widely applicable. One of my goals in this talk is to show you that the world is not divided into good people who make ethical decisions and bad people who don't. Rather, no matter how good we want to be, there are inner forces, inner demons in us that can derail our good intentions. So we need to be constantly vigilant and even seek outside help when there's a possibility that we might be fooling ourselves. These stories I'm going to tell you are detailed if you want to read them in a book that my wife and I wrote. It's mostly about other things, but you can get a free PDF on its website. That is anewmap.com. So 3 words, anewmap.com, run together, no space, no one. And if you go there, just look for free ebook or go to the Get the Book tab and you'll see it right there. I'm going to stop a second, see how this is looking before I do more. Well, I checked the video out, and it's not professional quality, but I think it'll do. So let me now go to the first story about ethical decision making. It's March 1975, a long time ago. The American National Bureau of Standards announces a National Data Encryption Standard, or DES. Whit Diffie, my colleague, and I looked at it and quickly realized that the key size, which was 56 bits, was at best marginal. The number of keys, 2 to the 56th, is roughly 10 to the 17th. That's 100,000 million keys. We postulated, and more than postulated, we estimated that you could build a chip, even with 1975 technology, that would search 1 million keys per second. You then buy 1 million of these chips, so you're searching 1 million keys per second. And how long does it take to search 100,000 million keys? Only 100,000 seconds, or not much more than a day. Those million chips cost about $10 each, so that's $10 million worth of chips, not unreasonable. We wrote letters to NBS that had promulgated the standard, more than suggesting, saying it was critical that they increase the key size. But after several rounds of letters and primarily ridiculous answers from the Bureau of Standards, we realized about 6 months later that we had a political problem, not a technical problem. The small key size was not a bug, it was a feature that would allow the American National Security Agency, but also, unfortunately, its foreign equivalents at some point in time, even if they were behind technologically, like Russia, Soviet Union in those days, to do an exhaustive search to break the system. So we realized that we had to get congressional hearings, we had to get media coverage if we were going to improve this standard. We prepared to do that, but as we prepared in January 1976, 2 high-level NSA employees flew out from Maryland and told us, look, you've got to stop talking this way. If you continue, you're going to cause grave harm to national security. So that evening, I went home to figure out the right thing to do. My intellect was telling me that the right thing was to go public, that NSA should not make a decision on its own in secret about what level of security the public should have. But I had these 2 NSA employees telling me just the opposite. As I tried to figure out the right thing to do, an idea popped into my head, unasked. Forget about what's right and wrong. Run with this. You'll never have more of a chance to have an impact on the world. Forget about what's right and wrong. Don't make the ethical decision. At the time, I was somewhat shocked by this thought, and I liken it to a movie where an actor has an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, and this is the devil whispering in my ear, telling me, hey, go run with it. At the time, I thought that I brushed the devil off my shoulder and made a rational, logical decision to go public. And we did. Now, we still lost that battle, although the current encryption standard, the AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, it does have a minimum key size of 128 bits. But that, well, it's not that even. About 5 years later, 1981, my wife and I are working on our relationship. We're at a week-long retreat to really think about the bigger issues of life. And we're watching a documentary called Day After Trinity about the making of the first atom bomb. Trinity was the code name for the test of the first atomic device in the New Mexico desert in July 1945. And the scientists who worked on it are all asked what was their motivation. And they all say the same thing, Nazi Germany. If Hitler got the bomb before we did, it would be 1,000 years of dark ages. Later in the documentary, each of those men, and they are all men, are asked whether they stopped to reconsider when Germany was defeated and their stated motivation was gone. They're perplexed, they don't know why, but they did not stop and reconsider. Watching them, I believed I knew the answer because I could see myself 5 years earlier doing the same thing. I thought I'd made a rational, logical decision to go public with the DES key size issue, but what I had done is what I believe those scientists did. I figured out what I wanted to do, go public, and then came up with the rationalizations for doing it, whether or not it was the right thing. And I think they did that same thing, although I can't be sure. I vowed that I would never make that mistake again. Now, by the way, I did make the right decision, and I know that because the director of NSA at the time, Admiral Bobby Inman, has stated more recently, I think 3 years ago, that when he was asked if he would still try to suppress my work, he said quite the opposite. He would try to get it out as quickly as possible because he could see how insecure commercial encryption was hurting national security with the Chinese stealing plans for jet fighters, things like that. So I was lucky I made the right decision, but it was just luck. If I'd been working on the A-bomb, it could have been a lot more serious. So I vowed never to do that again. But roughly 5 years later, it was around 1981, in the early 80s, I'm faced with another similar decision. I'll go into it. I think I can do it in a few minutes. Whit Diffie and I, along with Ralph Merkle, had invented public key cryptography, and Maurice can explain to you what that is, or most of you probably know. And we developed the system, and then RSA, Ravesh Shamir and Adelman at MIT developed the RSA system that most of you know about, based on difficulty of factoring. In their paper, they credit us with inventing public key cryptography. But when it came time to pay royalties, they had a very different answer. Your patents are invalid, sue us. Well, the bottom line is they ended up making $250 million, not just the three of them, but the investors, when they sold their company, whereas Whit Diffie, Ralph Merkle, and I made almost nothing from our patents. Now, there were other reasons other than the patent fight, but I was really pissed at the time at RSA. I'm not now. We're good friends. And I even see how they could see me as having started the whole fight rather than the other way around. But at the time when I was in 1981, I was still really unhappy with them. A startup company comes to me, the CEO, his name was Lou Morris, and he says, he was a scrappy guy. He was from Philadelphia, and he reminded me of the kids I grew up with in the Bronx. He said, you help me get an exclusive license to Stanford's patents, and we'll get those RSA bastards by the balls. Now, I had vowed 5 years earlier not to do things for the wrong reasons. And it seemed to me like the right business decision was to go with Silink, but I was concerned that I was fooling myself because I was emotionally invested. So what did I do? I went to my wife, Dorothy. I explained the problem, and she gave me a brilliant solution. She suggested that I go to the director of technology licensing at Stanford. He had the same business interest that I did, but he didn't have the emotional involvement in the issue. Let him make the decision. I explained this to him, and he said, oh, of course, we go with Silink. So I can be confident that I didn't fool myself. So there's a lot more, but I'll stop here. What do I want you to remember from all this? Well, I want you to remember what I said at the beginning. The world is not divided into good people who make ethical decisions and bad people who don't. Each of us needs to be constantly vigilant, seek outside help when there's any possibility that we might be fooling ourselves. The best place, maybe the only place where we have power to increase ethical decision-making is in ourselves. Thank you.
Now I know that Whit, Martin, and Vint all spoke to us by video link or pre-recorded message. But I think it's extremely important and extremely valuable to have had three such recognized figures speaking for us. Now, these three gentlemen all hold Turing prizes. This is probably the highest accolade that a computer scientist can get. And they came to speak for us, either by link or by video. We also did have a promise by Michael Atiyah to provide us with the video. Unfortunately, at the time that he was going to record the video, he had some difficult personal circumstances. There were various deaths in the family. So he wasn't able to help us out with that. But he is probably one of the most highly decorated, if one could say it, mathematicians of the 20th, 21st century. There is some support for this. And what I keep finding is that there's support amongst established retired academics. The whiter the hair, the more likely they are to think this is a good thing. The darker the hair, like other stuff I got to think about. And this is, I'm not sure what the actual sort of causation is here, but this is the pattern that we're seeing. At the moment, I'm just seeing patterns. It's up to us now to sort of pick apart these patterns. But yeah, I do want to iterate that I feel quite lucky, really, that we could get all three of them, and even the promise by Michael Atiyah, even though he couldn't carry through with it, to speak for us. It means that we're doing at least something pseudo-sensible. Otherwise, they get invitations to talk and stuff, by the dozen every hour. So it is a nice little sort of a positive affirmation there. We should move on. So our next speaker is Catherine Buell. Is that how I pronounce it properly? Oh, sorry. That is definitely true. It is Jane Hutton speaking. And should we? Her title is Talking and Writing About Ethics in Statistics, Success or Failure. Thank you, Jane.
I'm not even getting as far as a Blackboard talk. I'm just going to talk. So, no, there are no slides. No. So, again, I'm very honored, very pleased to be here because, well, Quite a few of my colleagues don't think I'm a real mathematician. Quite a few of my other colleagues think I'm far too theoretical. So I'm always sort of somebody who's on a spectrum, and actually I find my niche trying to do the translation from one community to another, or between various communities. I suppose I started thinking about and reading about ethics, I think when I was 12 or 13, I read Plato's Republic. I grew up in South Africa. My mother had been a pacifist in Nazi Germany. South Africa, you might remember, had this idea called apartheid, which is not unique to South Africa. So I suppose I had fairly good reasons to think about things. I also think, picking up this grey-haired comment, I've got grey hair, I have the advantage of having grown up knowing that if you believe something seriously, you have to be willing to die for it. It's not, oh dear, it might be difficult. I find the majority of Brits find that idea alien, the idea that your beliefs are important enough to die for. So I ended up at Liverpool. As a lecturer, I ended up going along to the philosophy seminars, and the philosophy professor was very encouraging, ran a journal called Journal of Applied Philosophy, and I decided I'd try to write something. And I wrote an article on statistics is essential to professional ethics, because I think statistics is part of epistemology. And in medicine, the equivalent of maths got nothing to do with ethics is ethics, we just do what's best for the patient. At which point I say, all right, let's think about what do we mean by best. Okay, the example I use is prostate treatment, where the criterion for best was cheapness and quickness of the operation, and incontinence and impotence were regarded as irrelevant. It usually gets most men to pay attention, particularly with a bunch of 18-year-old medical students. So I think one of the things that mathematicians do and statisticians do is they realize that when you say, is it good, you actually could stop and think about how many different ways of defining good we think of. Anyway, so it may just have been in that paper, one or two other discussions about ethics in randomized controlled trials. I then got asked when cluster randomized trials came in. So if you want to try out a vaccine, or if you want to try out vitamin A to prevent blindness in Tibet, you'll very often, for practical reasons, need to do that as a cluster. Equally, if you're trying to do educational interventions on nurses and general practices, it makes sense to do it by group, not by individual. So somebody said, well, we're just looking at the statistical methods and improving them. Can you write something on the ethics of cluster randomized trials? And so what I did was try to think through from first principles. What are the principles? What does informed consent mean once it stops being an individual? And that led to the guidelines that the Medical Research Council has published, which I was involved in writing. I was then asked about animal trials. What was the quality of animal trials? So whether people thought they were right or wrong, the question was, are they being done properly? And so out of this, I've written and regularly updated an article on ethics and statistics for the Encyclopedia of Biostatistics, which I guess a number of people might have read. And I've been invited to do some training sessions on ethics. So I would say those are probably some of my successes. I'm not sure the training sessions have achieved as much as I would have liked in trying to get people to think about their principles and then to act in a principled way. The 1985 International Statistics Institute Declaration of Professional Ethics does give a very detailed discussion. And again, having written things on the contrast between medical ethics and statistical ethics, medical ethics, although they pay lip service to the existence of more than two people in a question, most of them are focused on two people. Whereas the statistical code of ethics say, okay, we have people who are funding or paying, we have our colleagues, we have subjects, who of course may be a business rather than or it may be and then we have wider society. So I find that very helpful as a structure, because it's saying, don't just think about the individual student you're talking to. Try to think where you sit in the whole world. What about some perhaps statistics successes? The UK Data Archive has got a lot of archive data very secure. I invited over to New York, there's a Center for Urban Science and Policy, the head of the UK Data Archive at the time, and they were very gung-ho about their data and how secure they were. He just looked at them and said, you failed at the first hurdle. I could walk in here. You cannot physically walk into the UK Data Archive. They take data security seriously, but they equally recognize the value of the data, so they have levels of access and levels of anonymity and so on. I think that's a big UK success. The Royal Statistical Society, American Statistical Association, medical statisticians have had a big impact in saying small, badly designed medical studies are unethical. You're not going to learn anything, therefore they are unethical. Initially rejected. Frankly, now statisticians have got, if not a stranglehold, they're pretty powerful in being able to say, no, go away and redesign your study, because I'm not prepared to put up with your getting funded for something that is not going to work. Equally on official statistics, number of you too young to remember debates about unemployment statistics and changing definitions. The Royal Statistical Society campaigned hard to stop the country having a government statistical service, and the country now has an Office for National Statistics, which is independent. It has independent review. The latest achievement is to say that when statistics are going to come out, like unemployment or growth, there must be no pre-release to government. Two reasons. One, can't spin. Two, it was pretty obvious that the only 100 people who had it were leaking the information and people were using it for market benefit. So another success. A couple of things have been mentioned. The Flint water crisis. Lucia de Burke, who was accused of murder, or Sally Clark, if you like. DNA evidence in legal cases. Statisticians have worked quite hard. There's been quite a substantial impact. A lot more to do. What might be in process? Well, we heard about the reproducibility crisis and nudge unit. A PhD student recruited me, and I do mean it that way. And he's working on developing a checklist to look at the quality of social science research. I always knew why I avoided social science research. And in fact, the Behavioral Insights team in the UK has taken an interest, and in fact, he's already been offered a job at 63K, and he hasn't finished his PhD, but they want to start paying him a couple of days a week to work with them at NASDAQ in order to help compliance in the financial world, stop people either making mistakes or being able to trade illegally. Whether or not it will be a success, stay in process. I also wrote a paper called Some Popular Versions of Uninformed Consent, which I know has annoyed some people, but it's trying to redress the balance of saying people have to give information to get into things, but we don't care whether they're missing out. They don't have to have an informed refusal. And it's trying to look at general implications. One of my failures, my big failure, is the book that I was commissioned to write 10 or more years ago about ethics and statistics, which I failed to do. Oh, another thing that might be in process, given that this, we have an office, a room called Actuaries Room. I'm a little bit curious to find actuaries saying things like, well, yeah, we could get the right numbers, but we don't think it really matters. And, oh, no, we use various Excel spreadsheets, when I'm thinking, hold on, if we're doing medical trials, we have to have evidence documented at this level, this level, this level. We have to have the software validated. The FDA and the European Medicines Agency, if you turned up and said, oh, I did some things on an Excel spreadsheet, they have approved software, right? But if you're only dealing with 60 billion pounds, I suppose it doesn't matter whether you get it right or wrong. And I think that's quite a general challenge actually for any profession. Any profession can get complacent and just keep doing what it's always done and not think what changes there should be. Let me give you a couple of more specific things where I failed. I'll do the smaller one first. Abortion. I said to the group of philosophers, because I went to their seminars every week, I want to ask you a question as to how you would evaluate abortion in a particular circumstance. So I'm not entering into the debate about whether or not it's ethical to abort a child because they are disabled, Down syndrome and neural tube defect. You know, I have my views on that, but let's set that aside. We're just saying you've made a decision that if a fetus, a child, has got Down syndrome, it's legitimate to abort them. And I said to them, now let's look at the reality of the situation. How good are the tests? When I tell you that, say, for neural tube defect, if you have a positive result, the chance that the child actually has neural tube defect is, I've now forgotten the numbers, but is 1 in 10. Is it legitimate to abort? When I tell you that a positive Down syndrome test means there's a 1 in 3 chance that the child has Down syndrome, is it legitimate to abort? Now, why I say I failed was they could not engage with that discussion. They could not engage with the discussion. And you will find that most medical people cannot engage with that discussion. They will deny it. The occasional one will say, as a friend did, yes, I knew a woman who very fortunately managed to have a child. Her first pregnancy, she was told, was Downs. Well, of course, it was test positive for Downs. Child was aborted. Child was not Downs, but of course, you don't tell the parents that. Second pregnancy, you're at high risk of Downs because you already had a Downs infant. You're going to have amniocentesis again, and of course, the amniocentesis caused another abortion, which is known to be a risk. She did have a third child, but she was very fortunate. None of that gets documented. And in fact, there's a very impressive thing where you have an obstetrician saying to a woman, you're at very high risk of a Down syndrome baby, it's 1 in 200. And then when he talks about amniocentesis, he says, there's a very low risk of abortion, 1 in 200. So that isn't a total failure because David Spiegelhalter, who lurks in the next pavilion, has now worked on leaflets for screening. I've picked up, I don't get screened because I know the statistics too well. I've picked up leaflets on screening and they are now much better. They admit that there are false positives. But that's 30 years of work, and I'm not sure the termination of pregnancies admit that, let alone admit other consequences. What was my other failure? I'm rather disappointed Ross isn't here. He possibly forgot. But, okay. I was here 18 months ago, and he was talking about data and talking about how it's essential to have what I would quite specifically call individual informed consent, because paper I mentioned, I categorized different kinds of informed, uninformed consent and refusal. And that the first priority is refusal. And I said, well, there are choices to be made. And I know this because of the areas I work in. I was in a big legal case on metal and metal hip replacements. I've been in legal cases on side effects of drugs. It's not easy to get the data on that sort of thing. And on the metal and metal hip case, when I was asked about it, and my American colleague said he was using the English National Joint Register, I said, oh, I wouldn't bother. I'd go straight to the Nordic countries. And he went, what? But it's a really big register. And I said, yeah, they've got informed consent. I can tell you what the bias, well, I can't tell you what the biases are, but I can tell you how big they are. And in fact, in Finland, where I did a PhD viva at the end of February, the student had looked at these repeated lifestyle surveys. Finland has been very successful in improving public health in a large number of areas. They have questionnaires in which you ask people things like, smoking, drinking, exercise, and so on. Not everybody replies to those questions. However, in Finland, like most of the Nordic countries, there is a degree of social trust, which means you can actually link people up. Like Denmark, if you have a national identity number, that number is used from birth to death for schooling, for employment, for tax, for healthcare, for social care. You can link everything. And what the student had done the linking and had estimated how biased the data sets are, which you can do. The reason I say I think I've failed is that when I've tried to get people to have this discussion and say, okay, there are different societies, the UK and the USA typically value what they call autonomy and the individual very highly and have very low trust, not quite as low trust as in Germany, but pretty low trust. The Nordic countries have a priority on knowledge, on excellent healthcare, and they have a high level of trust. I can assure you, having spent quite a lot of time looking at metal hip replacements, the Swedish healthcare provision is extremely good. It's not perfect, extremely good, extremely effective, because they can actually find out what's going on. They can go and find pretty early on the surgeons who are getting things wrong and say, can we do some retraining? Or hospital has got something wrong. What is it that's going wrong? Because we believe you could achieve something better. But in a way, it links to this idea that of not facing the dark side. My feeling is when I say to people, we need to have a discussion on this. If you want individual informed consent, if you want opt-out, as we have, think about the consequences and make an informed choice. If you want to have individual informed consent, please stop funding any epidemiological research. We can demonstrate it is a waste of billions because we know it will be biased if you do that. If you want to have individual informed consent in the UK, then any funding for that kind of research must go to Scandinavia where they have a different set of rules and they can answer the questions. You are throwing millions away. And most people at that point simply go into denial and they say, no, we can always cover up for the missing data. And I go, excuse me, my research area is that area. So I feel that's a failure. And one of the things I think that I'd like to see coming out in due course of this workshop is that idea that people need to think about their principles. And we have different principles. We have different priorities for privacy and knowledge, and then act in a principled way and not simply say, I don't like it, so it's not true. And Ross probably doesn't remember, but I do remember him shouting at me and telling me I was irresponsible for raising that question because he said, in the US, Afro-Americans are reluctant to go to hospitals because they think data will be collected. To which the answer is, yes, I'm aware of that. And they've got very good reason for that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about the consequences. I know already that the US government relies on UK Scandinavia for information on effective medical treatments because the law in the US means you almost certainly cannot do the research you need. So I think those are what I would say are the failures I'm particularly aware of. Quite nice if I had the right person as a co-author for my book on ethics and statistics. And I think, there are plenty of successes and failures that might help people learn about what you could be doing in the ethics and mathematics, which is indeed slightly different from what's happening in statistics. So thanks.
So do we have any questions? And if so, I just wanted to say I want to mention two things. Firstly, the use of statistics in medical testing in terms of communicating to the patient. Okay, you've got this test has this chance of being right, this chance of being wrong. So who are the people who develop those statistics?
There's somebody nicknamed Professor Risk, otherwise known the Winton. He's got the Winton Chair for the Public Understanding of Risk, although I think he prefers to call it uncertainty. David Spiegelhalter, as I say, one of those pavilions. Oh, that pavilion. Okay. And the Royal Statistical Society does take that quite seriously. I've now realised, the other thing the Royal Statistical Society has done is contributed the debate on data ethics. And they also put in quite a bit of effort, along with the other international statistical community, to protect official statisticians. Greece, where the guy's being prosecuted, Venezuela, Puerto Rico. With things like Sustainable Development Goals or International Monetary Fund, a statistician can be under huge pressure to produce the numbers their government wants. So one of the other things I haven't really written about in a successful way is trying to write successfully about the ethics of a professional. What do I, as a statistician, do, when I am asked, we think there's been a miscarriage of justice, will you come into this? When we're discussing side effects of an anti-epileptic drug, I'm very clear that I'm a witness to the court. I discuss it with a colleague from the other side. We produce the evidence. But then there's also the question, what is the responsibility of the profession? Because individually we can't do it, individual things. But the Royal Statistical Society is taking quite a substantial professional response. We get inquiries and we try to respond to those inquiries collectively. And that's one of the things that perhaps could be a thing that comes out of this. The London Mathematical Society has a look at the codes of conduct that we've got, has a look at the kinds of replies, and starts to say, okay, on cryptography, we need to get people to realize they must come and talk to the London Math Society, as well as whatever the other relevant societies are.
We had a talk about a year ago. It was by Guy Lippmann on consultancy work here, Ethics Society. And one really interesting question he raised is, who's your client? Who are you working for? His context was, if you're working for a consultancy agency, are you, and you're employed by them, are you really doing your intellectual work for the benefit of that agency or the benefit of the client who's come with their problem? Who is the ultimate person that you're serving? Now, I guess a statistician could be asked the same question. If you work for the National Office of Statistics or something, do you answer to the government who's paying for this office? Do you answer to the public? Do you just close your eyes and produce mathematics and then hope for the best? Who are statisticians working for? Who should they see as their the sort of entity that they're producing results for?
So as I say, that's the point the ISI picked up, and it states, sorry, I do know the older version better. It states very clearly, there are four main groups you must think about, and none of them has priority. And it accepts that ethics is only interesting once you've got a conflict. Okay, sharing the biscuits in this room is not a big problem because there are a lot of them. Sharing the biscuits when you're walking 90 miles along the South African coast and there's a confusion on how much food you are bringing and there isn't enough, you find magically the women lose their appetites. So that's why I mentioned those four things. There's your funder, and your funder cannot tell you what outcome you're going to find. Okay, that's an issue for statisticians. This is what you're going to find. No. You can tell me what questions you're asking and what data you've got, but you cannot tell me what the answer is. So you've got your funder, you've got your subjects. If you, how will this benefit the chronic disease? Is obvious. How might this benefit people with asthma if I understand asthma better, or epilepsy? Not too difficult. But how might this help businesses if we improve the compliance to, we avoid money laundering? Well, that benefits the business because they don't get the fines. it benefits society. So you then get the society, and the comment on that is, it is very unusual for any investigation to be devoid of implications for the wider public. And then finally, it's your colleagues, which I think the medical profession has not been as good on as they might have been. If you make a mess of things as a statistician, that has implications for your colleagues. If Shipman kills off his patients, if Bristol Royal Infirmary ignores the death rates, that undermines your profession, not just you. So that, I mean, that's why it's not my document, but that's why I strongly recommend that document. Maybe even take it as a discussion document saying how much of this is relevant to mathematics.
And statisticians have some sort of like registration system or something. There's like you can be a chartered statistician, whereas that doesn't exist for mathematicians as a whole, from what I understand. And that's a point that I want to raise a bit later, that we don't have a guild. We don't have sort of an accreditation system. You can't be kicked out of the mathematics club because you never entered it. You can just do math. Oh yeah, if we have lots of guilds, little mini ones, so if you get kicked out of one, there are sort of n-1 remaining, where n is a very large number. Any more questions before we go to the next speaker?
Of the document that you were just referred to?
It's been sent to me. I'll send it around.
I think that often when people are working in any field, they have this tendency to work out what you can do, and then you do something. And I think we've got both an action bias that people don't like. When you're a consultant on a project, you don't like to do nothing, and so you'll do what you can, and you want to avoid conflict. So it's a lot more comfortable, and I guess particularly early on in your career, to find something that you can do rather than raise objections. No one wants to be, and I guess once you're more established, you can do that a bit more. But I think a lot of the power of an organization like a statistical body or councils or these sorts of things is to give people a bit of protection and to say, no, we will stop you from doing this, or for you to say, I'm not allowed to do this, because it recognizes this human tendency to avoid conflict and do something.
Okay, we now have Catherine Well, who's going to be speaking on meaningful mathematics, social justice, and ethical discussions in college maths. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I got to have some great conversations with Maurice before this all started. I'd like to start off just with two main points. One, that mathematics is not neutral, and it has never been neutral. We see this in many wonderful ways, where mathematics reflected the great things that society valued, and we had amazing, beautiful mathematics occur. But we can also see this in a bad way when, for instance, the poison gas topic that Bonnie Schulman had brought before, or other times when mathematics has been manipulated to be used to put down a certain population or prevent mathematics from growing or excluding people from mathematics. So we've seen both of these two ideas. My second point that I want to make is that there are benefits to this international partnership despite our differences. So I'm going to try to, I've learned a lot about how we view mathematicians differently, how we view or how our education systems are a little bit different. So I'm going to try to address that and see where I fit in, where you fit in, where we fit in, and how we actually have complementary missions, I hope. So I'd like to, address these moral principles and values that I think we can share. I understand you are Cambridge and I am not. I think the only person in the room who has ever seen Fitchburg State University is Piers. Accidentally, no, who knows? Yes. So it would be very odd for you to have heard of this, but I think having another voice in a room who has a different experience and is from a very different bubble can maybe help us see a little bit why mathematics hasn't been included in this conversation so far. I think part of it could be because we don't value the conversation. We're mathematicians. We don't need it, but I think there could also be that we have pushed others from commenting on our subject. We are the experts, don't come into our bubble, and perhaps we've isolated ourselves a bit too much. So being at the school I'm at, I have no choice but to work closely, and I love working closely with my education professors, sociology professors, historians, philosophers. This is just part of our ethos at my university. So I've learned a lot that that's not what is going on everywhere, but I would perhaps encourage that that's going to be important as we move on. Right. So just a sense of where I'm coming from. I'll talk a little bit more. To give you an idea, I am at a university that I teach everything from quantitative reasoning courses for English majors to things that would be included in some of your part 2 subjects. Thank you, Toby, for sending me out some of those details about what is covered. So that's a wide range. So just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm working with majors, mathematics and STEM students and bio students, but I'm also working with people who hate mathematics and do not see themselves as mathematicians. And so when I come to the ethical discussion, I'm both convincing mathematicians to incorporate ethics, but also in trying to get people who are studying ethics to see mathematics in that as well. So that is where I'm coming from, just FYI. But so, you know, so when I teach mathematics, topics that we see, so, you know, you have a problem set in your early days. This would be before coming to university, most likely for you, where, you know, there's the practice problems, the really difficult problems that, you know, are hard. And then every once in a while, there's a couple application problems. And in the US, at least, those application problems are always about money and banking and pop culture and TV and health and food. And it's possible only Victor will know what I'm talking about. I don't know what textbooks are used at the lower levels here. But other things you don't see are questions about distribution of resources. For us, mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, racism, sexism, environmental issues, ethical questions. And you might say, well, those don't belong. But I think James asked, I think it was James in his very first thing that he said he taught this class, an ethics class. And he told the students, go find a question. And he's like, they didn't know how to find a question. They didn't even know where to start. And I'd say, how would they know where to start if never in their mathematics education were they ever confronted with an ethical question or saw math as ambiguous, that they had to go into learn more and use mathematics as a tool for sort of a just society? How would they know where to find it if they've never seen it? Right. And so I think also, David, you mentioned it needs to be like integrated more because you found they need to have more pieces. So that's one of my goals, is to integrate this a little bit more across the curriculum. But I'm also going to tie in to the culture argument of mathematics, because what we see is amazing research. I'm an algebraist. On top of teaching non-majors up to some of your part 2, I also take part in the academic world as a pure mathematician and a researcher. There's the pressure to publish and get grants, perhaps a little less for me, although I still publish and get grants. Competition, isolation, question mark. Some may feel that, some may not. I don't feel isolation because I collaborate on most of my research projects. I collaborate with other algebraists. I collaborate with philosophers and artists. I collaborate with education. I collaborate with philosophy and psychology as well. But we do see a lot of ego and a bit of sexism. And I think that this could get in the way of us creating a good ethical culture, at least in my opinion. What we don't see is the deconstructing of this hierarchy. We don't see ethical questions, and we don't see people playing well with others. I'll get a little bit more into that, but that's going to be a big part of making this work. So I'm going to try to take this more from the pedagogical standpoint. We've had a lot of talk about the profession and the research obligations, but I think that this also comes into the classroom. These are students who have really pushed this movement. Well, so what are we saying to students in the classroom? So what we teach, how we teach, and why we teach is shaped by a lot of different things. Pedagogy has a lot of components to it. I should say I used to teach at an elite institution in the US, and I left. because I wanted to focus more on who we teach and who is allowed to be in the mathematics classroom and who is not allowed to be in the mathematics classroom. I should mention I also teach in an American prison, which is a very different mathematical experience than in the university classroom. These little tiny things at the bottom are examples of the classes where I have brought social justice or ethics into the classroom. So a wide range of things, and probably it isn't till maybe later on here that it is things that you might be talking about in university here, right? The first might be for our beginning math majors or for non-math people at all. Great. So I don't know if you can think back to when you took your first calculus class, okay? And I also don't know what the textbooks are like here, so Victor, don't say because you'll know. But when you started doing optimization, okay, you know what I'm going to say. What was the first type of question you were asked? Oh yeah, I want you to talk. First question you were asked in optimization. What is it here? Is there a canonical example? Right, cheap. Yeah. So in the US, it's a farmer's building a fence. I don't know if that's okay. All right. Maybe that's a cultural, the farmer and the fence. And who cares, right? You don't walk out of the classroom being like, yeah, that farmer, you know. It didn't happen, although my sister's a farmer and I have used optimization to help her make a horse training pasture. So I always have to mention that. But you don't walk out of the classroom thinking like, wow, that's something that is impactful on me. That's a way that I can see my role in the world. But here are a couple examples of things that you can bring into a calculus classroom that start those conversations around the mathematician's role in the ethics of the world. How do we participate in the conversation? We are part of the conversation. And then it's not so strange when you get into the professional world to say, of course, there's ethics here as well. So I'll let you read through these. If any of these are interesting to you, they are actually appearing in a Primus. So Primus is an undergraduate journal in the US. And Bonnie Schulman and I are actually editing this journal right now to incorporate tools to incorporate social justice and ethics into the classroom from the quantitative reasoning level up through graph theory and computational mathematics. So that's going to be coming out. And if anybody's interested, shoot me an email and I'll send you a free copy. I will make sure to set you up with the appropriate places to get yourself a copy. All right. So one of the classes that I actually do teach is a statistics class. And again, I take a different approach. First and foremost, I created this course in collaboration with education and behavioral science professors, right? And we came together to create this course in statistics. And one of the things that I do is a math biography. I do this for my prisoners. I do this for all my mathematicians as well. This might seem odd, but I have them tell me about their math experiences. Again, we have different students. However, then they have to come to my office and talk to me about it. And this is one of the ways that I try to create a culture where people are going to feel more comfortable being uncomfortable. We read like willing to be disturbed. What is going to make them, this class is potentially going to be uncomfortable, different than any other math class you've had. How can we deal with that? And then we talk about what's commonly talked about in statistics. And then we talk about what we're going to talk about. So actually, for me, I contextualize every single topic in a social justice issue. Why do I do this? I have nursing majors who are going to be in the medical field, who are going to be needing to treat people from different races and ethnicities. I have police officers, future police officers. Teaching a little bit of empathy and ethics will never hurt. Okay. And then, of course, I always start, I want to talk to them about there's a lot of things about mathematicians we don't talk about. Get a math historian to tell you about how not so great some mathematicians are that we know. And talking about the ethical issues that they had. So we talk about eugenics and Pearson. Like, there's a lot to be said there. And I think students deserve to know before we go citing off p-values where the legitimacy of them came. And then, of course, because I am in the US, I really want to stress students having local, national, and global knowledge. Then there's other places like more advanced classes where I like to take the redistricting and gerrymandering topics into class. This is a big topic in the US right now. And there's a great group at Tufts University who is sharing, collaborating, giving away their materials and research on this topic. They both train mathematicians to go to court, and they also train undergraduate professors on how to teach this in their classroom. So I take this material and I adapt it down to my students who are just learning geometry, or my future school teachers, all the way up to my research students who are going to be programming a Markov chain Monte Carlo method and adding in other parameters to be able to find even a better fit than what they've done in, say, Pennsylvania. Right? This is a wide-ranging topic, and students can see it built and integrated into their curriculum. Finally, decision theory, a big thing with environmental justice. Where are they dumping trash? Why are they dumping it there? Where are they putting wind farms? Who is affected? All those kind of questions are coming up for our students. And if you're interested, here's all the other things you could talk about. All right, and they come up, and I do things for other sciences as well, so that they can talk about some of these things. So why do I do this? I want to change the dialogue that students have. Okay, is this going to be on the test? Right? They're always potentially going to ask that, but I'd rather have them ask me, like, how can I test these ideas? I don't come in with a set opinion. I just present them the situation, right? We're all willing to be disturbed, respect each other's opinions, respect each other's backgrounds, so they can change their frame of mind. Or why do I need to know this? How am I going to use this in my career? All those questions. You know, why don't I learn about this in every class? Right? I have, again, I'm dealing with students who hate math sometimes. Okay? And this is, I know we come from different ethos, but they hate math because they've been told you're not good at it, you're not part of the club, or it just never resonated with them. But when you tie it to something that resonates with them, their ethical, their morals, they feel a little bit better about it. When am I going to use this, right? Instead of, I want them to ask, what kind of problems can I now go out and solve, both mathematically and socially, right? If you want to, what kind of problems can you now solve are the questions I want them to ask. So are these hard conversations? I am lucky I have support from my department. I have support from administration. I was only told, don't start a riot. Was the only thing I was told, don't start a riot. Still working on that, starting one. Yeah. Support from the mathematics community. Yes, there is support from the mathematics community, but I feel like different communities have different cultures and norms. And I think we should be a little bit more open-minded about what it means to be a mathematician. I'll be honest, if I learned that the only way to be a mathematician is if I have Asperger's, or if I identify a certain way, I would feel like I don't belong in the club and I shouldn't be doing mathematics. So I always try to be very careful about, who can be mathematicians and what a mathematician looks like. Some professors say, I don't feel qualified to have these conversations. Get over it. You're a member of a democratic society. You need to have them. What do I do when things get out of hand? I try to do everything I can to prevent that. Right? The willingness to be disturbed, the open office hours. I think someone mentioned being accessible to your students. And some people say these don't belong in a mathematics classroom, and I think that's akin to saying that ethics isn't part of mathematics, right? This is part of the discussion. And most importantly, it's really important to show our students respect and the desire for them to be part of the larger community if they choose to be that way, and to help them see themselves reflected better in their studies, right? Again, that's opening the door to allow more people to participate in mathematics, to see themselves as mathematicians. So I told Maurice that I would end with what can we actually do just to kind of get us refocused, because I think this is a really important idea. I know I'm coming more from the ethics pedagogical tools at the lower levels, perhaps integrating it a little bit into the curriculum. But I think that that's important because it's not just research, and you can't expect somebody to walk into an analysis 2 class and suddenly do proofs if they hadn't been trained and integrated all along and built up those skills. Right, so if we want them to have some ethics and some understanding about mathematics and the roles we have, We need to integrate that throughout their education. It can't just be a one-off idea. Finally, let's see. So I think Jane actually tied in nicely. What can we use from other places that are already existing? Let's do that. Can we be a society that supports mathematicians to do good and prevent them from doing bad? Is that what we want to be? What is our message? Can we create tools? So I think that that's what I was speaking of. Can we adapt more inclusive language? That would be wonderful. I think if you really want this to catch on nationally, which I think we should, I think having more inclusive language, bringing more people to the conversation is important. You've demonstrated that by taking somebody from Fitchburg State University and inviting them here. But I think that that's really important. This is not just a profession. This is not just for the people who are at the R1 universities, the highest ranking places. This should be something that everyone thinks mathematicians are part of this ethical discussion. Non-mathematicians should feel that way. Mathematicians should feel that way. So when we are talking about our audience, which I think you brought up, I think it's great to preach to the choir, but it's very important to also, I'm not religious, so saying convert weird. But important to bring people into the conversation, right? I think it's ethically right to do that as well. So actionable items, writing a clear, inclusive, short document that's framing our ethics and our belief in mathematical. We need ethics in math. So how clearly state beautiful thing on the website. But is there ways to tweak it to become applicable to people outside of this building? I love the journal inside your newsletter, which is an action item that gets people started. Collaboration with others, be nice. There's felt like there's a conflict between people who are not mathematicians to come and speak in front of this audience. You know, we really love to weird the air. We know what our field is. Don't tell us something else. Even though your PhD is in that, we know something about it, which is true. We're very smart people. I get it. But playing nice with others in other fields, not scorning our education colleagues, not turning down our historian colleagues. Like, I feel like you can build better things with kindness and a little bit of it. Organize a workshop where you live. Victor and I are already talking about organizing a session. Come visit us, right? I came all the way to you. Your turn. So something like that, but keeping things moving, right? Keeping the ball rolling, do something where you are. You want to come? And then finally, essentially gather some kind of course materials, discussions that you've had with higher ups to get support. You've been able to get grant funding for these things. How did you do it? If you've gotten support from your president, VP, I don't know what your system is, chancellor, whatever it is, how did you do it? What are you using in the classroom? What have been great talks that are going on? Is there a central location where we can drop those materials so that everyone can have equal opportunity and access to them? So I feel like this is a good slide to perhaps have discussions on, but that's all I got.
We print that and we nail it to the wall. Just want to make a few comments before we jump to questions. Can we go back one slide? I don't feel qualified to have these conversations. I've had several mathematicians come to me and say, "Who are you? What makes you qualified to talk about this?" And I respond, "I am the worst person in the world to talk about this. And the best, and the tallest, and the shortest, and the fattest, and the thinnest, because as far as I can see, I'm pretty much the only person talking about this. So you can put me at any extreme of the set of measure of size 1. What? But the reason why we may not feel qualified, or people will question us being qualified, is because no one's qualified. That brings me to the next point. You're from Fitchburg. You are one of the world experts on this. There are more people from Fitchburg than Oxford here at the moment, than MIT, than Harvard, than Stanford, than ETH Zurich. These are the leading institutions on this. Okay, it's not the institution that matters, it's people inside it doing it. I think it's quite telling that we currently have, am I correct in saying 0 Cambridge academic mathematicians in the room, apart from those already in a t-shirt? Yes, 0. Yeah, so you've come from Fitchburg. Our faculty couldn't cross the cam for this. Okay, please. This is where the expertise is, and I think that's important to hammer home. These topics not belong in a mathematics classroom. It comes from, well, we've never seen these in a mathematics classroom. We as mathematicians teach our students truth, absolute truth. What we don't teach them is meaning. 2 + 3 = 5. This is absolutely true. What does it mean? What does 2 + 3 = 5 mean? Depends. If I have $2 million and I invest it well, and I earn another $3 million, I then have $5 million. Now I have meaning. In our mathematics classrooms, we spend all our time teaching truth and no time teaching meaning. What is geometry? Well, geometry you can do in a completely axiomatic way, but when you start drawing triangles and circles in the sand, we start leaning a ladder against the wall, that's meaning. The reason why we struggle to see why these things don't belong in a maths classroom is because you don't have anything in the math classroom. And this gets down to the pedagogy of how we teach mathematics or how we don't teach mathematics. Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience? Jane's hand went up very quickly and excitedly, so. Here you go.
Thanks, Catherine. One of the points that I was pleased you brought up was who is a mathematician, because there's this tension within statistics. On the one hand, the Royal Statistics Society wants as many people as possible to understand as much statistics as possible. On the other hand, they also think it's useful to have chartered statisticians so that if you are deciding whether there is a major epidemic and you ought to do something about it, does this drug work or so on, you can be reasonably confident that the answer is correct. And I think that's a difficult challenge. It's a very difficult challenge for statistics. I can't see it's going to be any less difficult for maths.
So not in any way related to the previous question, but you talked about the importance of engaging with colleagues from an education background. As you'll have picked up from an aside remark I made yesterday, I've tried to do that and at times found it an extremely frustrating process. Have you any advice you could give for mathematicians trying to engage the educational research with educational research literature without flipping our lids because the paradigm is so totally alien to us?
So I'm lucky that I speak a lot of languages. So I started off thinking I wanted to be in education. And I started off a lot of my training working with teachers. So when I was 18 years old, I was working with teachers. So I was able to learn their language. I think the best thing is to take a day to leave your ego completely at the door and completely open-minded and frustrated. When we first started this collaboration, it took 2 days for the 2 mathematicians to be able to communicate with the education professor and the biological science person about what raw data was. Like, it was amazing. We just weren't speaking the same language. So I think really just taking that time, being willing to be frustrated and annoyed is important. But doing it anyways, and then maybe finding someone who you know might be already on your side a tad.
Find a translator. If you're speaking to someone in education, find someone who's done math and education. Speaking to lawyers, find someone who's done math and law. Speaking to psychologists, find these translators. They do exist, and it makes life a hell of a lot easier.
I just say I want to say I really like what Jane was saying about who is a mathematician, because as soon as she highlighted Catherine raising that question, my first thought, which I think I'll probably I will stand and die for, is that all of us, not us in this room, humanity, every human being, I think, is a mathematician. I've heard several talks in the last few years about the role of mathematics in humanity and for Francis Su, former president of the Mathematical Association of America, has a talk called Mathematics for Human Flourishing, and it's being turned into a book. And I think the moment that we sit down as children and say, you know, how many biscuits are in this package, or more interestingly, is this do we have 2 boxes of juice here or 1, because they're different boxes?
But who's allowed in the door to even try to do that was more of my message. The messaging to sometimes young women that you are not suitable for pure mathematics, you should go into physics instead. Or computer science is a little too much for you, how about civil engineering? That more messaging of who gets in the door is what I mean by who gets to be a mathematician.
On a sort of slightly related point, which I mentioned yesterday, ask your non-mathematician friends, what does a chemist look like? What does a doctor look like? What does a lawyer look like? Okay, what does a mathematician look like? And I mean the majority, the 90% of mathematically trained people who are not in academia. Can you draw a picture of them? What do they wear? What do they do? Where do they go? Where do they work? We disperse. This university graduates 400 mathematicians a year. Oxford the same. Other UK universities probably slightly less. Around the world, God knows how many are coming out. You think they're all going to academia? There are not that many academic math jobs. They're going somewhere. And they sort of shapeshift. They lose that sort of badge, that external visible identity, but they're still mathematicians. We need to keep tabs on them. And this, we go forward 1 slide, please. This, some sort of internationally recognized society that you can take away someone's mathematics card if they misbehave. We can take away. I think that is yet another actionable thing. But yeah, basically, we print this, nail it to the wall, and just go through it one by one. We now have Tom Linster from Edinburgh, and he's going to be talking about the Snowden revelations 5 years on.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for organising this conference. It's a truly amazing array of speakers, and I think it's actually testament to the interest that there is in ethics and mathematics, despite how some of us might feel in our more gloomy moments. I'm going to talk about something that happened 5 years ago, or that began 5 years ago, rather. So I'm going to start by just recapping what did happen, or maybe telling you some of you for the first. So 5 years ago was the beginning of a long series of reporting on a leak. And what the leak was about was the intelligence agencies, largely in the US and the UK and their allies around the world. So the main players in this are the following organisations. There's GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, which is one of the British intelligence agencies, which has its headquarters in Cheltenham near Bristol. There's the American National Security Agency, the NSA, and these organizations are extremely large employers of mathematicians. The NSA is said to be the largest employer of mathematicians in the world. It seems to employ about 1,000 people with maths PhDs. GCHQ is small, but still a very significant player. And they work extremely closely together, and also with other military organizations, intelligence organizations, police, and so on. A third organization, which I mentioned, is the Heilbronn Institute, which is really just another name for one arm of GCHQ. It's somehow the academic wing of GCHQ, the mathematical wing. And so they have a building in the center of Bristol. They have connections with the University of Bristol, about 30 fellows there, and some other fellows around the country, more and more. And I'll come back to that. So Heilbronn is just a kind of a name that is used for that part of GCHQ's activities. Right. So what happened in 2013 was that a former computer security professional who'd worked for the CIA and contractors for the NSA leaked an enormous archive of documents, of confidential classified documents to journalists who went on to report them. And so the aspects of that leak that attracted most attention was surveillance. So, as people say, spies spy, and it's no surprise that spies spy on the people who we'd like them to be spying on. I mean, of course, what has the most media attention at the moment is Islamic terrorism, but other forms of things that are kind of everyone agrees are bad. However, the most notable revelation from Snowden's leaks was that actually they are spying on you, on all of us, and collecting huge amounts of information about everyone without any sort of suspicion or discrimination. And this is done by various means. I mean, basically all the means you can think of. But your email is being spied on, your web browsing, your phone calls, your text messages, your Skype calls, your bank transactions, your physical location, tracking device that you carry everywhere you go, and so on. So basically, anything that can be tracked and recorded and exploited on an industrial scale is being tracked, recorded, and exploited on an industrial scale. It's kind of tempting to think of GCHQ as sort of the amateurs compared to the NSA, given the general UK-US relationships. But actually, that's not the case, partly because of legal frameworks and the lack of a written constitution in the UK. So Snowden said GCHQ has probably the most invasive network intercept program anywhere in the world. And the overall ethos was very nicely captured in a slide that was leaked by Snowden. This is a slide from the NSA in a presentation to GCHQ. And it's just generally, here's how we're going to do things from now on, from about 6 years ago. Collect it all, collect all the data. Process it all, know it all, exploit it all. Right? Collect absolutely everything. So it's clearly articulated there. And actually, sort of without meaning to, David Cameron said exactly the same thing. And this is when he was Prime Minister. So what he said was, in extremis, it has been possible to read someone's letter, to listen to someone's call, to listen in on mobile communications. The question remains, are we going to allow a means of communications where it simply is not possible to do that? My answer to that question is no, we must not. In other words, he's saying any possible form of communication between two human beings must be accessible to us, the government. So the NSA slide and what Cameron said are pretty much the same. So most people, honestly, are not actually outraged about this. And the reason why is that there's a kind of spectrum. There's a spectrum between you sharing pictures of your dog and you planning to bomb a train, right? And you probably don't really care, and you know that no one's interested in pictures of your dog, no one on your site. And we all would like the intelligence agencies to be stopping people bombing trains. However, in the middle zone, there is, among other things, legitimate activism, such as could be possible in any democracy. So an interesting zone, for instance, is environmental activism, for example, anti-fracking activism. And there's a very distressing history of basically everything in that zone has been disturbed and been subject to interference by the intelligence agencies. It's very easy to collect incidents of this. And environmental activists are absolutely peaceful, law-abiding environmental activists are routinely labeled as terrorists and, quote, domestic extremists. They are labeled as a threat to national energy security, to the country's economic well-being, and you can find many documented incidents of this. You know, Green Party members, one Green MP in this country had her communications monitored and spied on. So this is the kind of danger zone in between these two extremes of dog pictures and bombing trains. So as I said, it was the surveillance that got the most attention, but the possibly a more significant aspect was the failings of democracy. So Bill Binney, who knows infinitely more about these things than I do, said yesterday that he said, once you put them, that is the intelligence agencies, once you put them behind a secret door, you don't know what they're doing. And it is absolutely true that no one knew what they were doing. The parliamentary oversight committees, parliamentary intelligence committees in both the UK and the US didn't know what the intelligence agencies were doing, much less approve them. And of course, we, the people, gave them no democratic mandate to do these things. And the oversight system in this country is laughable. I can't resist sharing with you the following incident. So the Intelligence Services Commissioner, up till a little while ago, was a guy called Sir Mark Waller. And when he heard the Snowden revelations, he said, and I quote from the Home Affairs Select Committee, when he heard the Snowden revelations, he said, crikey. He went to see the Deputy Chief of GCHQ to reassure himself that there was no foundation to all this nonsense. And so here he is in front of the Select Committee being questioned by Keith Vaz. And so Vaz says, so how did you satisfy yourself there were no foundation to allegations? It seems from your comment that you had a discussion with them. Well, says, certainly. You heard what they had to say? Certainly. And you accepted what they had to say? Certainly. Is that it? Certainly. Just discussion? Certainly. And that's why you're satisfied there was no circumventing UK law. You went to see them, you sat around the table, you had a chat, and you said they had to make out their case, and absolutely clearly I accepted it. And so it's an oversight role. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not going to argue with you. Right? So those were some of the things that happened initially. So I want to talk about the reaction a bit to bring this back to the mathematical sphere. So, but first of all, I mean, the media reaction was enormous. There were kind of loads and loads and loads of news articles, and I just put some random ones up here. You know, this was prize-winning journalism, Pulitzer Prize. There was a film about it by Laura Poitras, which won the Oscar. And so all of this happened. Now, the mathematical establishment, however, did not react in the same way. Every month, the London Mathematical Society, the LMS, produces a newsletter. Month after month, as these things about the largest employers of mathematicians in the world were appearing in the newspapers, there was nothing in the LMS newsletter. And it was utterly surreal. I was thinking if, for example, there'd been a massive scandal in the publishing industry involving the biggest publishers in the world, and it was all over the newspapers, and the publishing industry newsletter just said absolutely zero about it. Yeah. And so I couldn't really believe this was happening. Yeah. Yeah, so I will come to that. I'll come to that. So the LMS, I mean, after I pushed them, the LMS eventually did start to get in on it. The AMS were a bit more active. They, the American Mathematical Society, but their problem was they wanted to have a debate between sort of the two sides, and they couldn't find anyone to write in defense of the NSA. Eventually they did, but all the people who did write in defense of NSA were employees or former employees, and that's just the way it went. So, I mean, the obvious question is why the mathematical world reacted the way they did. And I think here you have to distinguish individuals and the establishment, individuals and organizations, because almost always in all contexts, individuals are more radical and establishments are more bland in their opinions and actions. So, but it has to be said, individuals didn't do very much. When I was pushing, I felt pretty alone. One reason for that, I think, is something that we've seen over and over again over the last couple of days, which is that we mathematicians are not very used to thinking and responding ethically. Another one, I think, is these outdated pair of labels of pure and applied maths. Many of the people involved in this are discrete mathematicians. GCHQ likes, for example, combinatorialists, graph theorists, number theorists, yeah, which are supposedly pure, but actually their work may be much more directly applied than someone who spends a lifetime studying the Navier-Stokes equations. Another thing I think which is common to not just mathematicians, but everyone is the abstractness, the indirectness of stories about surveillance. And again, this comes back to this this spectrum where you are between a dog picture center and a train bomber. And I want to put up a quote from Glenn Greenwald, who was the journalist probably most active in reporting Snowden leaks. So he said the following: "There's a bargain that's offered in all political cultures that essentially says, if you make yourself completely unthreatening to what it is that we in power are doing, we will promise that you will be more or less left alone and unbothered. If you just end up being a submissive citizen who acquiesces to what it is that we want to do and don't impede what it is that you want to do in any way, you don't have to worry, you'll be more or less left alone." So it's basically saying, if you stay the right side of that kind of middle activism point of the spectrum, then you don't really need to think about this. And that's true, right? I'm just about politically active that I do worry about these things occasionally. I'm not, you know, going through border checkpoints and so on, but I'm probably slightly more active than most people. And so that's actually a rational reason for individuals to not really think about this. The establishment, I mean, universities, departments, and so on. Well, of course, establishments tend to move slowly. There's also the funding problem. So who employs mathematicians? Who sponsors conferences? Well, I can think of three classes of people of organization. There's intelligence community. There's has a certain reputation. There's financial institutions, and of course, after the financial crash, that reputation also suffered. And there's the military, high-tech weapons manufacturers, and so on. So there's a group that destroys liberties, destroys livelihoods, and destroys lives. And it's very hard for a head of department or a dean or whatever to decide that they're simply going to turn down all of these funding opportunities. But I think also there's this very seductive idea of that there exists a neutral or apolitical position. And I mean, for this audience, I don't think I'm going to I need to spend time debunking that too much, but it is extremely seductive to have some freedom removed, to think I'm just taking an objective position, that I'm not being political. It's really makes life much easier if you remove some agency, you remove some freedom. But I think it's also true that to be able to say I'm apolitical is definitely a sign of privilege. It means that the status quo aligns with your identity or your beliefs, and that you find the status quo an easy or natural condition to live in. And I think it's very like the debate that appears quite often about politics and sport. In the US, there's been this thing about protests during the national anthem in football games. And in Spain this evening, there'll be a big football game where the Spanish national anthem will be played. One of the sides playing is FC Barcelona, and Catalan supporters, some of them will jeer over the national anthem because they object to what Spain is doing to Catalonia. Now, some people will say to that, you shouldn't make sport political. But that's the position of privilege, because playing the national anthem is already political. If you're on the kind of the dominant side, you see playing the national anthem as kind of something in the wallpaper, right? So, and similarly, if you're part of the dominant mathematical establishment, you might see GCHQ or Heilbronn funding as just part of the wallpaper. And to object to it is political. But to say yes to it is exactly as political as saying no to it. Or, you know, the thing that Maurice just mentioned, if you run the LMS or AMS newsletter, to accept an ad from the intelligence agency, to agree to publish it, is just as political as saying, no, I'm not going to publish it. When I think back to, when I look back on what happened several years ago, there are two things that particularly strike me. One is that almost everyone who was visibly saying stuff failed. And I don't really have much more to add to that, but it struck me when I look back. And was how incredibly patronizing the intelligence community was to ordinary mathematicians. And at first I just thought, well, that's just an irritant. Oh, those guys are annoying. But actually, I think it's really worth thinking about why they were so patronizing. Which I guess I have to start with saying how it was patronizing. So the typical thing that happened was that someone would write, some mathematician, some ordinary person would write a very thoughtful, properly evidenced piece about what was going on, you know, with 16 different references to the Snowden documents. And then someone from GCHQ would write something that kind of looked like it had been written by a robot, or probably written by a committee. And it would, every single thing that was written by anyone who had anything to do with GCHQ or NSA, every single thing, without fail, refused to engage with any of the facts from the Snowden leaks. And it was like, it was surreal. Here was this thing that everyone in the world could discuss, but they just refused to discuss it. I mean, probably they weren't allowed to discuss it by their employers, but you know, that's their choice to work for them. And it just made it impossible to have an intelligent debate. They refused to engage with the documentary facts, the undisputed documentary facts. And at the same time, they would insinuate that we didn't know what we were talking about, and really we would have a fact-based discussion. You know, and you know, if you knew what was going on, you wouldn't say that. Oh, right, let's discuss what's going on. And probably the low point was that Thomas Hales wrote a great piece in the Notices of the AMS about how the NSA had put a backdoor into a cryptographic standard. And a guy, I think it was called Michael Wertheimer, who had worked for the NSA, he wrote a three-page long piece in response to this about this, kind of insinuating that it was all nonsense. But in those 3 pages, he never actually denied it. And of course, this was spotted immediately, and you know, and people immediately, you know, eminent people wrote saying, "Dude, you didn't deny it," and it's just, you know, it's treating us like children. Did he think we weren't going to spot that he hadn't said no, we didn't do it? And so yeah, so you want to think about why exactly they were so patronizing. So one of there was actually one good reason, which is that they know things we don't. But there are many bad reasons, and I think one of them is simply that the people in the intelligence agencies are not used to having to answer to anyone. And I say this not, well, they're not used to answering to us. They should do, yeah. Yeah. I mean, but it's a completely unfamiliar sensation, and I say this without, this is not a joke what I'm saying now. I mean, the people from GCHQ and NSA are professionals at deception, at subterfuge, at secrecy. So having a truthful, open, fact-based debate seems antithetical to what their job is. And of course, they don't want a fact-based debate. Bill Binney yesterday called them cowards. They want to be left alone to do what they do without scrutiny. And I think the last reason why they're so patronizing is they can be. They have power. However, they still need us. The organizations, they need a steady supply of mathematicians to work for them and computer scientists. They therefore need us on side. They need heads of department on side to agree to stuff. They need publishers of newsletters to agree to publish ads. They need conference organizers to take their sponsorship. And for example, so like most British academics, I'm an advisor to a small, about a dozen undergraduate students. One of them asked me for a reference letter to go and work for GCHQ, and so I had a chat with him about whether he really wanted to do that, and he decided not to. So we have this power. Okay, so I want to finish by saying a little about what's happened since the bulk of the Snowden document report on. So outside mathematics, right, at the political level, to a first approximation, nothing has happened. I mean, some small things have changed, but essentially nothing has happened. At the technological level, much more has changed. So more things have become encrypted, and people have been making encryption more user-friendly, easier to use, which is an enormously significant thing. So that's been happening in the non-mathematical world. In the mathematical world, and I'll talk about this country only here. So GCHQ and Heilbronn have been on this kind of reputation laundering spree, which basically means a money spending spree. And they've thrown a lot of money at the mathematical community. So they do that by hiring fellows. They do that by sponsoring conferences. So, for example, there was a British Mathematical Colloquium here a few years ago, which they sponsored, and they did some recruiting at. There was I think, quite well-selling book called the GCHQ Puzzle Book that I saw on the Christmas shelves of the bookshops a year or two ago. And I think it sort of promotes the idea that GCHQ is full of jumper-wearing crossword enthusiasts. Rather than the people who supply intelligence data to the drones that go and bomb people and terrorize large populations in Pakistan and Yemen. The most sickening thing for me personally is, so Alan Turing was my academic great-great-grandfather, and they've appropriated his legacy in a way that is, I think, hypocritical even by their standards, which is that, so Turing was a gay man who was chemically castrated by the state, and his wife, he thought, that to have killed himself as a direct consequence of that. They have been very enthusiastically appropriating his legacy because he worked for their predecessor, Bletchley Park. But think about it a little bit. So 60 years ago, sex between men in this country was illegal. Now, 2 men can get married with full endorsement of the state. This came about through exactly the kind of activism that they and their partners are now interfering with great enthusiasm. So appropriating his memory kind of makes you feel sick. So I want to just end by talking about the grassroots, so the people in this room. achievement. I think that's the most important thing, actually. So I think this incident, the Snowden incident, and also the financial crashes have raised consciousness, which I think is the most important thing to do. So my general impression is that the very large majority of mathematicians are deeply uneasy with the activities of the NSA and GCHQ. So, for example, I know a department where someone very senior in Heilbronn was going to be invited, but so many people in the department registered discomfort with this that he wasn't invited. I know someone who used to work for GCHQ before the Snowden thing came out and now feels kind of rather ashamed of themselves for having done it. I know a head of department who supported people working for GCHQ in their departments and now feels bad about that too. And I know many more people who just won't touch anything to do with them with a barge pole. The most common dilemma that comes up is to do with funding. So, for example, let's say Heilbronn offers you some funding to work on, I don't know, non-commutative ring theory, and you think, kind of what fools they are. They'll get nothing from my research. And the important thing there is they're not buying your research, they're buying respectability. They may be buying you, but they want to normalize their presence in the academic community. So that, to me, is the strongest reason to object to that. So, so I think humble actions are the most important thing. You talk about these things. You think about the funding question. The last time I was invited to a conference in the UK, I asked, before accepting the invitation, I asked whether Heilbronn were funding it, and it turned out that the organizer was very sympathetic to that question. The answer was no, but he was glad I asked, and so on. And so I think people are more receptive than you might imagine to this kind of conversation. It's important just to keep talking, keep raising consciousness. And so the very last slide I have is a kind of it's a famous quote. It's kind of meant to be, cheering you up. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. There's less trite than it might look at first, because almost by definition, established power will never change the world because established power is already where it wants to be. So this group of us, although we might feel like, we're untrained, we don't know what we're doing, this is the only way things actually happen. Thanks for listening.
I did speak to Bill Binney a few weeks ago about this sort of idea of receiving money from large organizations for pure math research. Well, why do they care about algebraic topology? The reason is that once somebody starts giving you money, they have something to take away from you. And then this dissuades you from ever speaking out or acting against their interests, because that indirectly acts against your interests. This is something that we need to be aware of. As soon as we accept money, as well as normalizing it, it also makes it something that can be held over us. I have a question for everyone to keep in mind. 2 seconds. I mentioned a letter of reference. So, of course, people argue there's no ethics if you do pure math research in an academic institution. I'm studying in my 12-dimensional spaces. No ethics here. Okay, sure. Tell your colleagues this when you get home. Say, the most nasty, evil, bad, existential threats posing organization you can. Now imagine that one of your students comes up to you and asks for a letter of reference. What will you do? And in particular, ultimately, even after discussion, if they still want to go and work there, would you write the letter? Now, I've had mathematicians, before I even gave my answer, they would say to me, well, of course you have to. What do you mean I have to? Well, you can't refuse the letter. Do you have any reason for why I can't refuse my letter? Well, it's part of your job. No, I've read my contract with the university. Nowhere does it say I have to provide letters of reference with my students. This is before I gave my actual answer. and they said, well, it's completely, they said it's not an ethical choice. You just have to. You should go and think about that a bit. Think of the words coming out of your mouth. So without actually presenting my opinion, just go and talk to some really pure mathematicians, the ones doing the 12-dimensional stuff, and ask them whether they'd write a letter and see their response. And then you see whether there's ethics in pure math research or not. And Jane had a question.
I certainly found it very interesting, and it some of your comments on the arrogance and the patronizing are very similar to comments I've had when I've said, why don't you, why do you do calculations based on the incorrect estimates when you could do them on the correct estimates, and you get patronized or blocked or whatever. Having said that, I don't necessarily want to destroy the actuarial profession. And I'm remembering what Martin Hellman said, and with Greenwald, that's what I'm saying. I grew up with this. There is conflict in the world. If you spend all your time worrying about, if I take this money, I can't ever say anything, actually that's not true. A lot of these decisions are up to you. Most of us do want some kind of protection from terrorists. And yes, I think we need to be active, but it seems to me the activity needs to be proper oversight and not necessarily just saying, close the thing down, because unfortunately, there are even nastier people out there. And so how do we, I think it's a dilemma, but I don't know what the solution is.
You can refuse a child dinner until it behaves itself. And I think that's you can send the child to bed without dinner for misbehaving. It doesn't mean that you've kicked the child out into the street. These are the sort of tools at our disposal. We can refuse places like this dinner until they start behaving themselves.
You put it more elegantly than I would have done, so maybe I won't put it at all.
I want to go back to what you said. The most common dilemma that comes up is funding, and I want to ask what alternatives exist, what alternatives could be created, and Maurice said, it's kind of like when you take funding from a place which is not aligned with your values, then you're not actually getting given a resource, you're being lent a resource in some way, because you don't have the optionality resource that comes with the resource. There's an expectation, and it's like shareholders, right? Shareholders in companies are just an example of this. What they want is rarely, contradicted by what actually happens. Whether or not it's best for the company or the people or the customers or whatever. So the difference between sort of borrowed resource and owned resource, and I wonder if like some kind of weighting by optionality power with the resource that you get given when funding would be a good way to decide over sources of funding. Not sure how you'd measure that optionality, but anyway, what other sources of funding exist, and like, yeah.
I don't have any special knowledge of sources of funding. I think the only thing I can say relevant to that question is maybe a bit tangential. So I recently read Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, and she's actually, apart from pointing out various things that are problematic, she's actually quite good at suggesting things that are positive, that are maybe not so different from the things that are negative. So, for example, I'm certainly not against all financial mathematics or all the ways that financial maths is used, because, for instance, I'd quite like to have a stable pension, and I think the studying of how that can be made to happen is a noble and useful thing to do. But yeah, if anyone else in the room has ideas about the funding thing, then speak.
So perhaps not like organizations, but more like industries, for example. Which industries would alternatively be better funded?
I don't know, unfortunately.
Okay, the